So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Laux has his screen off. Who else are we missing on that? Okay, there's Representative Laux. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All House members. Okay. Senator Wassenberger, where's he at?
I don't know. Said he was going to be here. Okay, we're live. We'll go ahead and get started. First order of business is announcements. Do we have any announcements? Mary Beth, do we have any announcements?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I have an announcement. I broke my clavicle last Friday, the 23rd, and I'm having it operated on tomorrow. So I'm going to leave the meeting early tomorrow. And I'm heavily sedated today, so it should be a more pleasant meeting for all of you. First order of business is a roll call. So Mary Beth, can you do that roll call?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Senator Beitman.
Here.
Senator Coe.
Here.
Senator Rothfuss.
Here.
Senator Wasberger.
Excused.
Representative Burkhart.
Here.
Representative Craig.
Here.
Representative Duncan.
Here.
Representative Ayer.
Here.
Representative Furphy.
Here.
Representative Henderson.
Here.
Representative Laux.
Here.
Representative McGuire.
Present.
Co-Chairman Greer.
Here.
Co-Chairman Anderson.
Here. What's the count, Mary Beth?
All present with one excused.
Okay, all right, we'll go ahead. We've got a big agenda today. We're going to try to get through. We got a lot of people that want to talk to us, and a lot of them have checked in already, and we have a list of them. And some haven't checked in, haven't done what they're supposed to do to get checked into this thing. So we'll see how that goes, and if we can hear from all of them. I don't know if we can or not. So first order is energy strategy and issues. And this is our interim topics 1, 3, 4, and 5. That's how important this subject is, or these subjects on energy are. There's 4 different interim topics. So we'll kick off the first one with the LSO topic introduction, staff, Legislative Service Office. I'm assuming that's Brian.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, among the materials is just a topic summary for the energy strategy topic. And basically it's just a summary of various issues that the committee is endeavoring to consider in this topic, and then just highlights of legislation that was passed last year. So the topic overview, I'll just hit on the high points, describes previous efforts for developing a statewide energy strategy, going back to 2001 with the Wyoming Energy Commission, which was repealed, that developed a comprehensive energy policy. And then in 2013 and again in 2016, the governor's office developed an action plan for energy, environment, and the economy. Where the governor's office developed various objectives for expanding and diversifying Wyoming's energy industry. The summary also covers 2 bill drafts that may be relevant to the committee's discussion, either at this meeting or at meetings later this interim. The first would be 2020 House Bill 200, which requires the Public Service Commission to establish energy standards for the use of that a specified percentage of electricity must be reliable, dispatchable, low carbon electricity, which is electricity using CCUS technology that results in less than 650 pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour produced. There's also 2020 House Bill 159, which established the monthly payment of ad valorem taxes on mineral production. And in 2020 Senate File 139, which I'll discuss in more detail tomorrow, as that's a separate agenda topic for tomorrow. There's also the Wyoming Energy Authority that is slated to commence July 1st, 2020. The legislature passed House Bill 3 this past session, which amended certain provisions related to the duties and powers and purposes of the Energy Authority. It clarified the members, particularly the ex officio members of the Energy Authority, and also provided that 2 members of the voting board members must have pipeline-like experience or education in the oil and gas area specifically. That bill also allowed the Energy Authority to meet before July 1st for the limited purposes of electing members of the board in terms of the chairman, vice chairman, and secretary, beginning to take on administrative tasks such as selecting a location, selecting staff, and an executive director. The summary also provides a list of all of the funding that has been provided or made available to the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. That's on pages 6 and 7 of the summary. On pages 7 and 8 is a brief discussion of nuclear power issues. And then pages 8 and 9 cover the topic of securitization, which I believe will be covered subsequently later in the interim. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have on that summary.
Any questions on that first section? Representative Greer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just also to help maybe set the stage a little bit for today as we move forward. First up, so we've got Mr. Steege and Ms. Hutchinson, who are working diligently to help stand up the Wyoming, and then I see Paul just popped on the screen, who are working diligently to help stand up the Energy Authority. And so right now we're about 30 days out of really going live with Wyoming Energy Authority, which will in essence merge the Infrastructure Authority and the Pipeline Authority. It's been a 2-year project that this committee's worked on. Most of the members on this committee are familiar with the work that we've done. They've been tasked with trying to fund an executive or to do a search for an executive director to take over. And then at the same time, we've thrown on them this duty to help the state of Wyoming with a vision, an energy vision or plan moving forward. And this committee, I hope, has the opportunity to work with them over the years, quite frankly, with that and assist in seeing that come to fruition. So I think this morning what we're looking at, Mr. Chairman, is really where they're at, how it's going, and then to also maybe pick their brains a little bit by what I think is going to be our key question this morning is when prices return, what can we do to make Wyoming an attractive place to deploy capital and get back to our oil and gas operations and keeping people employed.
Any other questions? Any other questions about that summary? Any other questions? Hearing none, we'll move right on to Mr. Mark Steege with the Wyoming Energy Authority, and I think they're already in here. Yeah, there's Mark. Go ahead.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Greer, Chairman Anderson, members of the Joint Minerals Committee. My name is Mark Steege, and I currently serve, I'm honored to serve as Chairman of the Wyoming Energy Authority. With me here today, you'll see on the screen, are 2 other elected leadership positions, Paul Ulrich, who's Vice Chairman of WEA, and Wendy Hutchinson, serving as Secretary. We're excited to be here today and talk about all the progress we've made. Now, this is where my technical ability, I'm going to try a screen share. So hang on.
We've got the presentation in our books.
Yeah. Can everybody see the screen share?
Yep.
I'm going to start from the beginning here. How's that?
Good, good.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. So let's dive in. If we take a look at the agenda, we're going to spend a little time, as Brian prefaced this, talking about, and Chairman Greer did as well, talking about the purpose, mission of WEA, board members, some of the key action items, the to-do list outlined by House Bill 3, progress to date, dropping all the way down to the feedback. And it's really important for us as an energy authority to listen to you. And we look forward to your recommendations as to next steps for our energy strategy and our vision for Wyoming. So if we take a look as a level set, WEA was created to combine Pipeline Authority, Infrastructure Authority, Energy Office into that one energy storage authority that represents all things Wyoming energy. And really from the beginning, whether it's Infrastructure Authority, Pipeline Authority, or this new Energy Authority, we know that this has a potential to be much larger than the combined entities, and we're excited about that. So if we take a look quickly at what our mission is, lots of words there, but our mission is to diversify and expand the energy economy, Wyoming energy economy, through improvements in energy transmission, facilitate production, development, transmission by planning, financing, construction, energy exports facilities, by advocating for technology, carbon capture, associated transmission and transportation infrastructure, distribution facilities, lots of good words in there, and quite the to-do list. But expanded into this also. Yes.
Before you move on there, I had a question on that one. Your mission says it's acquiring, maintaining, and operating electric export, energy export, and energy. Is that right? We're actually thinking about operating some of that stuff?
It is, and I'll let Paul and Wendy weigh in, but when we take a look at it down the road, once we've identified gaps, and we're going to talk quite a bit about some gaps that have been identified in talking to some of our partners, we believe there's opportunities, if there's the right business case in the fit, for us to step in those owner operator shoes. A long ways off, we don't even really have any potential projects, but this legislation gives us that ability to step in and really help add value to that value chain.
Okay, all right, I just saw that and thought, that's a pretty big job.
It is, it's exciting.
Set there, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Representative Greer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just as a point of clarification for the committee, it's nothing new. This was existing when when the Pipeline Authority was established, as well as a transmission authority, was the ability to operate these types of infrastructure systems to fill a void within the state of Wyoming. It was just a tool that was provided in the legislation many, many years ago. So not a new concept to us.
Big job, though. Senator Coe, did you have a comment? Oh, he's working with somebody else. Okay, Mr. Dickey, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Thank you, Chairman Greer. So we take a look at what the mission is. Again, the first bullet there talks about administering the state energy program. When I look at the next two bullets, it really talks about that one-stop shop concept, where we can assist in securing project financing, obtaining permits, regulatory approvals for any business wanting to operate in Wyoming on the energy space. We look at the fourth bullet down, talk about promoting Wyoming energy resources through education. Next bullet, really adding value to that value chain with a focus on market growth, export terminals, facilities like this. The next to the last bullet, work with this committee and other leaders to develop and communicate our energy strategy. It's important to know where we're going, so we make sure we're in lockstep. And then lastly, Chairman Anderson, this is the point that you were talking about. We have an opportunity to construct infrastructure and projects that will add value to the energy projects in Wyoming. Again, a ways off, but it's nice to have that, as Chairman Greer said, tool in the tool belt. So with that, I want to do a quick spin through, please, of the board members. We have a great board, very diverse board. On the voting board side, appointed 7 voting board members appointed by the governor and then confirmed. Great mix of expertise. I'm the utility guy. The rest, we have strong expertise in oil and gas, coal, transportation, coal exports, CO2 pipelines, and a mixture of all the above. And then we weave in the ex officio members who bring just top shelf level of expertise from the School of Energy Resources, EORI, Governor's Office, Business Council, and Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Healthy board, strong board, very passionate, and it's really a lot of fun to have these meetings. So strong board members. So some of the key action items, as Brian framed up on the front end of it, This last legislative session empowered us as a WEA board to take action prior to July 1, so to make sure we hit the ground running. Specifically, there's 3 different categories there. 1, develop priorities and mission statement based upon the purposes and duties of the WEA. The second one, hire staff to begin July 1, including an executive director. And third, complete the administrative tasks necessary for WEA to effectively function beginning July 1, including determining the office location and space for ongoing operations.
Mr. Stiggy, did I read somewhere that you guys were going to office in Cheyenne?
We are. That's the next, Chairman Anderson, that's the next slide coming up. And so that's some of the progress we have, Chairman Anderson, is tons of work has been done considering we launched 7 weeks ago. We've had scores of meetings and subcommittee meetings in the last 7 weeks. It started with a kickoff, as you know, Chairman Anderson, Chairman Greer. We had opening comments by both chairs and the Governor Gordon for our first half-a-day meeting. What we've accomplished since that time, we elected leadership, and just real quickly, I was chosen for chairman just because I'm the current chairman of WIA, and the group thought for continuity of leadership and pulling it across the finish line, it would be good to have one of the 2 leaders, so I was elected for that. Paul Ulrich, strong oil and gas knowledge and experience, and then Wendy Hutchinson, strong coal export and transportation experience. So we like the diversity of leadership, the diversity of really the fuel specialties and the mix there. We did post for an executive director on the 22nd of April. The applications closed on May 18th. Just to give you a quick rundown, we winnowed the list down to 10 candidates for an initial interview. We will complete that first round of interviews this Wednesday. We are going to meet this Friday as far as a full board. We'll go into executive session. We'll take that list of 10 candidates, we'll winnow that down to 3 or 4 potentially, and we'll invite them for an in-person interview June 15th and June 16th in Casper. And
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Yes. Oh,
Thank you,
President
thank you,
Duncan.
Mr. Chairman. Can I ask Mark, are any of your candidates for the for your I guess what is it, a CEO? Are they going to be a Wyoming resident? Versus I know that the pipeline authority person was not so previously. So is that going to be one of the caveats that and requirements is that this person is going to be a Wyoming resident, or is that a qualifier?
Mr. Chairman, through you, Representative Duncan, yes, that's part of the job qualifications is they have to be a Wyoming resident.
And I'm assuming they're going to live in Cheyenne.
Yes, Mr. Chair, through you, yes, they will live in Cheyenne.
Any other questions? Other questions? Okay, yes, go ahead, Mr. Steve.
Okay, continuing on, we selected Cheyenne as a location of WEA. Healthy debate. The debate was between Casper and Cheyenne, but at the end of the day, the vast majority of the board member felt Cheyenne was the better location for the primary location. However, we do have offices available in Casper, and we have offices available at the ITC as well. That decision was critical early on because then we could inform the WIA staff who's located here in Cheyenne that their roles will be transitioning to the WEA on July 1st. Followed up on the heels of that, we began the process of unwinding the Pipeline Authority offices in Casper, including that knowledge transfer down to Cheyenne. And then lastly, which is probably sets the stage for the bulk of this presentation, the rest of it is really foundation work, and this is as well, but we began strategic discussions with a handful of key partners across the state. Mining Association, Business Council, SER, EORI, Petroleum Association, Campbell County Commissioners. First of many, our goal with these meetings was, number one, just get an understanding of the great work that they currently have done, take a look at what their current focus is, and talk about the current projects underway. And then probably as important as all that, get an understanding from their perspective, how can the WEA help them achieve their goals and their missions? So great conversations, and I'd like to share with you some of the takeaways from that.
Mark, just a
Mr.
question.
Chairman, sorry to interrupt, but Senator Wassenberger needs to be allowed to join our meeting. Sorry. So Mary Beth could let him in.
I have a quick question, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Representative Duncan.
Thank you. Mark, can you elaborate a little bit on the decision of being in Cheyenne versus Casper when most of the energy production is in Casper, and the proximity of Casper being closer to Campbell County with the ITC as well? It would seem that it would be more prevalent to be and make more sense to be in Casper versus Cheyenne. So can you elaborate on that?
Mr. Chairman, through you, Representative Duncan, you stated it head on. That was the argument for Casper, center of the state, industry hub for the state. The other side, when you take a look at Cheyenne, we look at proximity to the capital, proximity to School of Energy Resources, Business Council, proximity to a major hubs in Denver for DIA for transportation. And much of the oil and gas activity, as I know, being a prior geologist living through the 80s, has retracted. Many of the hubs are in Denver as well. So lots of time on the oil and gas side is spent in Denver, in South anyway. So again, weighing both of those, it was not an easy decision. And it was not, again, but the majority vote was to house it in Cheyenne with the primary location, with the opportunity to have a strong presence in Casper and at the ITC in Gillette as well.
Well, we're building a office building, state office building in Casper. There's going to be a lot of empty offices in Casper. So you should be able to have a office in Casper that is fairly reasonable.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that was the thought.
Representative Crank, excuse me.
Yeah, Mr. Stiggy, can you give us what kind of staff do you have? What are and
Chairman Anderson, through you, Representative Luthi, you broke up, or at least on my side, maybe I broke up. But I think the discussion was on staffing from WIA. We have a director of communications. It's been in the role for a few years now. We have an accounting manager in Cheyenne, and then we have the person administering the energy efficiency piece already in Cheyenne as well. So when we looked at that decision, by choosing Cheyenne, we had a staff that we could bolt on to the WEA, very competent staff, versus the decision to stay in Casper due to some of the folks had already announced retirements and things like this. We'd be building the staff from the ground up in Casper. I hope I answered your question, sir, because you did break up.
Did that get it, Representative Crank?
yes, so it looks like you have 4 additional staff plus the hire, am I correct?
Yes, 3 staff plus an existing executive director from WIA. Correct.
Mark, will you take over the offices there in Cheyenne that they are presently in?
Chairman Anderson, yes, the early on in the discussions, working with the landlord, there does seem to be space available to expand that, but again, too early to tell, and we're currently working with the landlord and looking at other opportunities as well. But right now we can stand it up with the existing facilities. It may be a little snug, but we do believe there's potential to add space to the existing facility.
Okay. Any other questions? Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just think initially that Cheyenne does seem to make sense to me. I certainly see some need later on to perhaps look at other places, like even up near Dry Forks in terms of research, other things going on. But initially kicking this thing off makes a lot of sense in Cheyenne. Thank you. Sounds
like you don't have the geese in the background there, Representative Henderson. You got a dog. Any other questions? Any other questions? Any other questions? Any other questions? No. All right, Mark.
Thank you, Chairman Anderson. Moving on, everyone, if I could sum up every one of the conversations we had with the strategic partners across, we all started with the need of the all of the above energy policy. It was very clear, and the focus on diversifying the economy. But every conversation quickly pivoted to the crisis that we're currently in. Really the need to act now, the need to really do things as a state that will position us so that when the rest of the country gets back to work, we can get back to work providing the energy that they need so desperately to continue. So when we take a look at some of this on the slides, some of the feedback from, again, these partners, and it's not all the partners we interviewed, but some key ones, we could bucket or group this into 5 main categories. The first 2, I really look at the same. We're going to talk in some detail about what they are. Wyoming state regulations and taxes, federal regulations and taxes. And what we heard from them is there's a general consensus that there's a strong need for the WEA to advocate for policies and procedures and regulations that promotes energy development. How can we focus on eliminating barriers for conducting business in the state? And how can we basically send a message that Wyoming's open for business? Now is the time to do that. And we're going to talk specifically about some of the recommendations from the group for Wyoming and then the federal side. Project initiatives. I know there's much better lists out there, but these are the projects that with our conversations, the team put together. So I'll briefly be touching upon that. Education, don't have a specific slide, but education communication is key. It's something that's woven through everything we do, as you know. We cannot possibly over communicate and over educate from this standpoint. And lastly, but not least, is the technology innovation side of it. How can WEA support that early stage work done by SER, EORI, ITC, and many others, just to take and move these projects from laboratory size, bench scale up to commercialization. So there's a focus and a need, what we heard from the group, for WEA to be those advocates, seek funding, and educate on these projects. There's no questions. I'll go on to some of the specific recommendations. And I know later on in this morning's presentation, I am blessed by having Randall Luthi from the Governor's Office, Travis Detaille from Mining Association, and Pete Obermueller, Petroleum Association, who will assist in providing different details on this if asked. But really the first category, Wyoming regulations, these are things and actions. These are specific actions that are in our control. What can we do now to improve our chances to springboard the Wyoming economy when a recovery does happen? So there's just 3 basic kind of groupings. Examination of Wyoming bonding policies, whether it's modifying the idle well bonding policy or reviewing of the bonding calculations on the coal side, seeking temporary waiver of penalties and fees from Wyoming Department of Revenue for all extractive industries there. And then just a broad statement, is there an opportunity to explore current tax and other physical policies to encourage energy production in the state? Pretty broad categories with lots more detail to follow. But again, these are the consistent themes we heard as we talked to the partners across the state.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Representative Greer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Steggy, with respect to the second bullet point, seek temporary waiver of penalties and fees, could you just elaborate on that just a little bit so we just a little better understanding of to what extent what fees we're talking about, and then to what effect, what positive effect that might have in stimulating development.
Chairman Anderson, through you to Chairman Greer. I'm going to defer this one to Mr. Ulrich on because he is the expert on the oil and gas side. Paul, please.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's a good question. We haven't dug in depth to some of those recommendations at this point. Clearly, some of that is already in the works with Department of Revenue, so I think we're comfortable with where we sit right now. Later on, Pete may have some additional information on that, but this was simply some feedback we'd received, Mr. Chairman, and worth exploring honestly in the next few weeks.
Okay, no, thank you.
Okay, all right. Go ahead, Mr. Steggy.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Anderson. Rounding the corner here, federal regulation and taxes, just an overall consensus that the state of Wyoming needs stronger partnerships and working relationships, and the belief from every one of the interviews that the WEA can help strengthen all stakeholder relationships with the federal delegation. So a stronger need for that. So some of the items that were brought up is temporary reduction in royalty rates for minerals produced on federal leases for all extractive industries. The immediate release, advocate for the immediate release of the $150 million from the U.S. Department of Energy for the purchase of domestic uranium stockpile on the uranium side. I know Travis Detail can provide some information later on that. And then the extension of the 45Q tax credits for carbon capture storage. I know there was some new information that came out on Thursday. I have not had the chance to take a look at that, but stay tuned. So I believe there's some movement in that arena. Okay. Moving on, major projects. Over the past couple of years, one of the overarching goals that we have heard clearly for the WEA was to speak in one voice and to be that one-stop shop for entities wanting to do business in Wyoming. We thought the best way to start is take an inventory of the projects that we have, and then have these meetings with our strategic partners. So this is not an all-inclusive list. It isn't intended, but it's a start. So some of the common themes that were identified when talking with these stakeholders were, the emphasis on the WEA needs to have a big piece in advocacy and education, federal planning, and project analysis, and the funding side of it, seeking federal, state, and other funding is key. So major projects initiatives, again, DOE Carbon Safe project is huge, very strategic. CCUS at existing power plants initiative is going on. The coal exports, ITC, CO2 pipeline, Carbon Valley, Jordan Cove, and then our transmission projects for Transwest Express and Gateway West. Again, not all inclusive, but a start. And I'll talk a little bit later on how we're going to keep on developing this list.
Mr. Chairman?
Representative Greer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Steggy, one of the interesting things in talking with a lot of folks and trying to figure out a path forward as we keep talking about the price differential on oil in the state of Wyoming. And so I know 10 years ago when I came in, the pipeline authority had worked hard to reduce the price differential on gas and to knock that down. Looking at it for oil appears to me to be much more complex than for gas. And I'm almost wondering, as we move through this summer and this energy authority gets its legs underneath it, is if we don't look at some sort of dive into what's driving the Wyoming price differential on sweet crude.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, through you to Mr. Chairman. Yes, that's one of the initiatives. We all recognize as a board that there's some long plays out there with infrastructure and timing and things, but the here and now is on the oil and gas side. And this is one of the topics that was brought up again. What's driving it? What can we do as a state? How can we, is it infrastructure that we need? And if we do, how does that pencil out, and how can we add value? So thank you for that feedback, Chairman Greer.
Other questions? Other questions? Go ahead, Mr. Steggy.
So last slide I have here is just on some of the next steps. And overall, again, we look forward to even the comments today that you have on where we've been, where we're going, and some of the next steps. Some just general categories. We talk about establishing goals for the WEA once we're up and running. When you take a look about a statewide vetting process on new projects that come in. But key to this, as I look at this list, is the top one of talking with you folks and getting the leadership view on where we go with the Wyoming energy strategy. Filling that WEA executive director role is key. We've got 12-person volunteer board that's worked 1,000+ hours, I'm guessing, easily over the last 7 weeks and getting this done. So we look forward to getting that key position for the state in place. We'll continue the list of energy projects, and then take that list and with, again, guidance from this group in the governor's office, develop that energy project strategic roadmap. And then how best do we prioritize that? Because we don't have an endless pocketbook. We don't have endless human capital resources. How do we optimize that and prioritize that list? And then website and branding. So before I move on to just some concluding remarks, just a couple of them, I was going to open it up to Paul and Wendy if they had any comments. What did I miss, and to fill any gaps in? Paul, please.
Yep. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Over the last several weeks, we've, as Chairman Stiggy had mentioned, we've spent an enormous amount of time clearly understanding the landscape, and then most importantly, a focus on what we can do from a recommending standpoint on one side to help in a quick recovery. And then just as importantly, Mr. Chairman, what can we do as an authority? What hard levers can we pull via our bonding authority, via some of the other authorities that the legislature have given that allow us to take direct action? I think it is absolutely key for us as an energy authority, in concert with you and this committee and the governor's office, that we have that ability and we have a coordinated approach to pull those hard levers for a quick recovery. Chairman Greer, as you mentioned, the price differential, there certainly exists a price differential in natural gas today, as well as oil, a deeper dive in that. On the regulatory and the permitting side, I see the Energy Authority taking a strong, if not leadership role in coordinating with the feds as a cooperating agency in NEPA projects. The bonding authority is of significant interest to a number of entities out there, and how we can use some of these hard levers to actually move the ball on existing projects such as the Comber CIS if needed, future projects, and then honestly getting ourselves in a position of being competitive when the market turns around, and getting back to that level. I see a deep dive into supply cost. Are there elements of our business that we can bring closer to reduce the transportation costs? I see a deep dive on the financial side as well. I mentioned bonding authority, and certainly on the regulatory side, where can we influence and where can we directly help remove barriers? As you all know, in addition to the staggering revenue declines we saw last week, we continue to see a drop in rig count. As of yesterday, we had a whopping 2 rigs operating in the state of Wyoming, and positioning the state to be more competitive in a quick turnaround scenario, if we can help and be more competitive, is something that every single individual on the board has focused on.
Wendy, please.
Yeah, I think that Paul summed that up quite well. And I appreciate all the work that the full board is doing. I will just add from the coal perspective, coal mines are not dynamic animals. They move through the ground at a certain pace, and difficult for them to scale up and scale down quickly and radically, if you will. So for me, looking at the coal industry, it's still the long-term play. It is the work on trying to preserve the existing markets, and that's really a state by state fight at the PSC and PUD level, which the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority had been engaged in already, and we intend to continue that. And at the same time, we do need to look at market expansion through export, but also through the perfection, if you will, of making CCUS economical. And that is an important focus of many groups in the state, obviously, and we want to make sure that that focus continues as well.
Any questions for Wendy or Paul? Any questions? Any questions? Representative Grier.
If the committee doesn't have any questions, Mr. Chairman, just a couple of comments. And one is that I really appreciate the work of Wendy, Paul, and Mark, and the rest of the committee, and the ex officio members of this committee. I'm excited with what I'm hearing and what I see. To bring us together, to have so much expertise within industry, all working for a common goal, and then to be able to bring that to a point of focus is something that we just really need in this state. It will allow then the executive branch, and in particular the legislative branch, which holds the purse strings, to be able to take action and have an impact. Where I felt as if we've done so many things out in clusters in the 10 years I've been around. And again, all I can do is say thank you for the hours and hours that you're donating to the state of Wyoming. And I, for one, very much appreciate it.
Very good. I think we all appreciate getting this put together and the expertise that you've brought to the table with the thing. Mark, have you got more on that next steps?
No, I basically, Chairman Greer, Chairman Anderson, I just wanted to thank you for your feedback. Even in this COVID constrained world, so much has been done by this group. This is a passionate group of board members that are laser focused on advancing energy. It more so than ever now, almost 7 weeks into this, we are more convinced that we do have an opportunity to work collaboratively across the state, speaking one voice. We know we'll be that one-stop shop. How can we come alongside entities wanting to do business and help them with developing, the regulatory approvals and get funding and all those things that are critical, promoting Wyoming energy resources through a rich education piece. And then lastly, it's really, how can we help advocate dropping those barriers so that Wyoming is open for business and having an environment that promotes energy development. And then really the funding piece of it is huge, is really huge. How can we be laser focused on getting funding to help our key research that's going on at SER and EORI and others, and for just matching funds that are available. We don't know what we don't know right now, but we're going to find out soon. So, Mr. Chairman, we stand ready for any other questions or comments, and it was a privilege delivering this message to you today.
Wonderful. I think we don't have any more questions or comments. Questions or comments? Nope. Thank you, Mr. Stiggy and your crew for the presentation. We appreciate being up to date on your situation. Next up is Randall Luthi, the governor's chief energy advisor. Mr. Randall Luthi. And there he is. You've got to unmute. You're still on mute, Randall. You're still on mute, Randall.
There we go, Mr. Chairman.
There you go.
That
Yeah.
worked.
Yeah, that's better.
It's still a little new to me, so thank you all very much. I think it's somewhat new to all of us, but good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to meet with you and actually discuss some of my favorite topics, and that would be Wyoming, energy, and where do we go from here? You know, if we could include fishing, hunting, and the ability to continue to lose money on a cow-calf operation, then we would truly be hitting on all my favorite subjects. It's very difficult to imagine the enormous transformational change in Wyoming. Our energy industries and our energy strategy since I first testified for you last August. Somewhat steady increases in the oil prices then were encouraging exploration and development, particularly in the DJ and the Powder River Basin. Oil revenue was becoming more of a major factor in our economy, as well as the state's revenue portfolio. Our long-term financial anchor, that would be coal, continued to face a diminishing market. We were sorting through 2 coal bankruptcies. Now, the good news and update, of course, is that the purchasers were found for those mines, and they are operating today. At that time, the committee was charting a path, recognizing the continued interest in oil and gas and the importance of a combined energy approach. And that was shown in the presentation that you've just heard because of the combination of the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority and the Wyoming Pipeline Authority. And you are also evaluating the dual goals of energy development and the enhancement of our wildlife resources. And I might add, at that time, I thought a Zoom meeting meant that we just had to hurry. You know, I don't think any of us could have predicted the devastating economic aftermath of the combined effect of the Saudi-Russian oil well and the COVID-19 pandemic, both which occurred within the last 4 months. However, Governor Gordon's energy strategy and the prime directives of that strategy remain the same. Those are, number one, support and enhance existing and new energy-related industries. Number two, energy and the environment can both thrive in Wyoming. Number three, energy is a key player in the long-term revenue stability for our state. Number four, Wyoming must increase our ability to market her energy and energy-related products and add value to these resources. So what has changed is what comes first. We must address the effects of the present crisis and create an atmosphere for the support for a remarkable energy rebound. Governor Gordon firmly supports keeping Wyoming business alive long enough to thrive. So once again, keeping business alive long enough to thrive. We appreciate the efforts of this committee, your committee, and the legislature for establishing a grant program for the use of COVID-19 federal funds. These are truly emergency measures and are intended for temporary, short-term assistance. Governor Gordon has called and or written our congressional delegation, the Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Energy, and the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. He's recommended federal actions to assist the Wyoming economy and the energy industry. Those recommendations included the use of short-term federal funds to keep Wyoming business on life support. He has further recommended that the regulatory agencies adopt temporary relief measures, including but not limited to royalty reduction, suspensions of production and operations, and reasonable extensions of deadlines that would not have a negative impact upon our environment. Now, some have criticized the ask for royalty relief, since that relief could mean even fewer dollars to the already bleak state revenue situation. But I would ask, which is better, a temporary reduced royalty or zero royalties? Because that is a real possibility that should production be permanently shut in or these companies simply go out of business. I would suggest that it's better to do what we can do now to keep the energy industry here in Wyoming so that they can ramp up quickly once the economics have changed. The governor's efforts with the federal government continue, including encouraging clear, consistent policy from Washington to the federal state offices. On the state level, the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission temporarily suspended fees paid by the oil and gas industry. The governor directed that commission, as well as the Board of Land Commissioners and the State Land and Investment Board, to identify measures that could be taken on a case-by-case basis to provide some economic relief. He also directed the Department of Revenue to waive late fees and penalties where appropriate. To promote new and continued jobs, the governor directed that the DEQ and the Oil and Gas Commission needed to increase the number of reclamation and orphan well projects slated for the near future. These are all necessary and vital for short-term survivability. But as you know, what we do next will shape Wyoming's energy, economy, and revenue picture for the remainder of this decade and beyond. COVID-19 has not changed what is expected to be the long-term need for energy. Experts still project the world is going to need more energy. It is still predicted that the traditional energy sources will continue to be a large part of the energy mix. Frankly, Wyoming will still rely upon anchor energy industries as a tax base for our revenue. However, this is an opportunity to broaden our revenue portfolio. Power Wyoming is assisting in that effort and looking for opportunities to expand our economy and ensure that any diversification also means a diversification in revenue. During the past 2 months, Governor Gordon has personally contacted approximately 50 executive leaders in the energy field and asked, how is your business going? What can I do to help? What can Wyoming do to help? And has sought their recommendations. And if there is a positive in the midst of all this crises, it's the innovation and dedication of the Wyoming business leaders. They have taken remarkable measures to keep their employees safe, and there is a universal belief that things will get better. No doubt it will be different. Many business models will be changed permanently with the increased ability to work remotely, and technology will continue to change how we do business. Our energy companies know that the key to returning to producing energy, unfortunately, is largely beyond the control of this legislature or the governor. Domestically and globally, people have to start traveling again, building again, and above all, feeling confident again. We're committed to working with you to identify short-term continued life support measures, and I'm pleased to say that they're consistent with the WEA, that we're all on the same page. We want to look at continual additional temporary severance tax relief. We encourage the industry and our state agencies to continue to explore ways to streamline the permitting process so that as the economy improves, those permits are ready to go with a moment's notice. As you look for a longer-term solution, we suggest that we continue reviewing the oil and gas environmental regulations and air quality management issues in conjunction with the federal government. We suggest a regulatory review and recommendations concerning the flaring of natural gas. We suggest continuing efforts to produce electricity from Wyoming sources, including gas, wind, solar, and coal. And this includes promoting the CO2 capture made possible through HB 200. We suggest continuing efforts to develop foreign markets and to open ports for coal and other commodities. I note this is a key direction, once again mentioned by the WEA. We support the continuing research and development of coal products. After all, coal is not just for burning anymore. We continue research and develop markets for CO2. We encourage continuing identification and development of critical and rare earth elements. We encourage to continue to hone the coordination between the School of Energy Resources and the WEA and other matters of the state. We look for better leveraging of those few available funds. We encourage the better use of agricultural practices to be used as a CO2 trap. We encourage the continued support for the uranium reserve, and we continue to want to address the split estate conflict resolution. Those are not all that we're working on, but I think it gives a pretty good list of which we can all work on together. So in summary, literally and figuratively, there is a light at the end of this tunnel. The energy future is bright, but there is much work yet to be done. But this is what you do. This is what we have always done. We meet together, we get a broad range of ideas, we winnow some in, we add some more, and then we move forward. The governor and I remain convinced that we can have it all. We can have numerous energy sources, enhanced wildlife resources, and a balanced revenue portfolio. So once more, to the members of the committee, thank you for your service. And I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions and look forward to working with the committee as you all move forward on various items of interest.
Randall, I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions. Could you send that speech to Mary Beth so she could send it out to the committee members? There's a lot of good points in there that we obviously have been talking about for a long time, but you summarized them all very nicely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that. Of course, ideally you have had it before, but I hate to say I couldn't get my act together before the deadline. But I would gladly transfer that over.
Wonderful. And Representative Greer, I'm sure you have a question.
He is speechless.
Yeah. So, Mr. Luthi, thank you for your comments, and we all appreciate the governor's office having a vision identical to that of this committee. And, you know, I know Senator Coe and Senator Rothfuss and I have been on minerals for 10 years each. And these are all initiatives that we've been driving hard and pushing. And again, it's refreshing to see the executive in lockstep with us. So very much appreciate that. I do think, though, as we sit here on June 1st, and there are, I think, 2 drilling rigs working in the state of Wyoming, and we see our economy in peril for various reasons, that it is imperative that we pick 2 or 3 items maybe that we focus on. And it may be the case here that we do have a second special session. And now, right now is the time for us to act as the legislature. And so as I took some notes, you know, there are a lot of things that we suggested, and I have some questions. And I guess if I can rattle those off, but one is, I assume that waiving the late penalties and fees is something the governor can do unilaterally.
Mr. Chairman and Chairman Greer, yes, the governor can do that. We're temporarily, the current waiver was set for about 6 months. And so we're about in month 3 of that. So we probably want to be looking at what comes next with that. In conjunction with that, we also at least need to consult with the counties and their treasurers as well, because as we enter a new fiscal year, that also becomes, some of those also affect the counties. But yes, that is something we can do unilaterally.
And then I guess, Mr. Luthi, Mr. Chairman, if I may, because this is something I think is important and this committee can help drive, but that is a reclamation component. So as most everybody knows, my wife ranches in the corner of Campbell County in Sheridan Johnson, where there is still a tremendous amount of coal bed methane that needs to be reclaimed. And I think we've got Director Parfit is on here, and the oil and Mr. Watson as well. And there's 2 components of that. That's plugging the abandoned wells, and then there's also the reclaiming of those pits. What can the governor do? And then what does the governor need us to do to try to get some of these oil field service companies working this summer and fall to finish up some of that reclamation?
Mr. Chairman and Chairman Greer, I think the steps we can make is make sure that we're encouraging the ability to release funds. I know Director Watson has some updated information on the amount of crews that are available to do that kind of work. But I believe if there's a way even to use the COVID-19 funds, which I have to admit it isn't obvious right now to do that, but that certainly might be an opportunity to increase the amount of projects. On the coal side, the AML group, does have a dedicated source of funds, and Director Parfit can go into more detail. What we've done is ask them to see if you can't get some more projects in there for that. So I would continue to work with the legislature with better, actually more ideas of how to make more money available.
Sure. And Mr. Chairman,
yes.
I mean, we have the LSRA available as well. And that's why I say if we're going to take action, we need to do so very quickly and to try to drive that. And I suspect as the work continues to dry up, there'll be more and more vendors available, but we'll go through that. The other question was the relief on severance tax, which is something that the state can do without affecting our locals. It of course will come with a certain amount of controversy, but has the governor's office done any analysis of when that should occur? At what point in time would the implementation of a reduction in severance tax actually have an impact to encourage industry to drill.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Greer, I will tell you, we have not done an in-depth analysis of when. We do believe that the legislature made a great start with the current reduction, is dealing with new, again, how much has changed since February and March? Everyone was focused in, well, how do we get new production, new drilling going? I think we now need to look at how do we make sure we keep the production, the current production up and going. So I think that is appropriate to look at reduced severance for, again, an amount of time. You know, we suggested originally 6 months. That 6 months is ticking. I think we're more than willing to discuss a longer extension.
Okay, and I have one more follow-up and I'll be done.
Yes.
Chair. So you had referenced, Mr. Luthi, that the governor had spoken to over 50 leaders in industry and asked them, what can we do? What did they say? What was the number one item?
It was interesting, pardon me, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Greer. What I found most interesting, and I was able to sit in through, I think, nearly all of those conversations, is the first thing they addressed was the overall economy. They know that they can improve as the economy improves. But the more specific areas as they drilled into, many, particularly the oil and gas, indicated, you know, we love Wyoming, but it's still difficult compared to even New Mexico and sometimes Colorado of getting through the various permitting process. It appears that delay is easy to do, rather it be, you know, hearings before the Oil and Gas Commission, rather it be hearings before the Board of Land Commissioners. Their concern was it just seems to take longer than it should do. Their only other comment was we need to continue to keep working on the split estate issue. It's a tricky balance between landowners and mineral interest owners. And of course, those in the mineral interest area, just not sure that that balance is carefully and artfully crafted, so it's very, very clear.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rothfuss, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Luthi, I want to follow on to what Chairman Greer was saying, and first of all, express some appreciation for you know, consistent work with what the Minerals Committee has been prioritizing for a number of years, and having a common view between the executive branch and the legislature on a lot of these issues. And as we're looking forward, trying to figure a path forward, there are a couple of questions that I have that get at this most recent discussion. And as we're talking about idle and abandoned wells, starting there, it seems that one thing that will change is that there may be idle wells that are still commercially viable wells as we move forward. In other words, you don't have the economic incentive currently based on market prices to continue operation of a well that may then end up going idle. We currently have, through the OGCC, obligations that if it's idle after a certain period of time, that you'd be obligated then to plug and abandon that well. Does the governor's office have flexibility and the will to maybe revisit that schedule of events and particularly look at something new, which is to emphasize the economic viability and the productive capacity of a well instead of just whether it was or was not idle? Does that make sense? I mean, it's sort of a new territory where a rapid drop in price is going to change the economics perhaps, but not necessarily the long-term economics of a productive well. Any thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, thank you for that question. That's the short answer is yes. We do have interest and we do have the will. If memory serves me correctly, a company can quit producing and doesn't have to take a whole lot of action for at least a year. They don't have to start plugging in abandonment procedures. I think it's well worth looking at that time frame. Is that enough? Are there something we can do to maybe, and again, it's going to come back to the economics, is maybe try and get that production up and running. And that's where we might be able to do something with the severance tax.
Well, Mr. Chairman, follow up on that.
Yes.
I think it's more nuanced than that, though. I mean, sometimes 12 months isn't very long, and sometimes they should really start at plug and abandon after 12 months. It really depends on what that well looks like. And it's my understanding we don't do a lot of looking at the well and looking at its history of production and trying to have some sense of what future potential production of a well is going to be in our process for plugging and abandonment. And this is something that I can ask the director about also in a little bit. But if there is not currently statutory flexibility to allow that type of economic consideration of future production potential, I'd ask you to take a look at that and let us know if we need to make any changes. Because we are at a unique time where maybe things based on market prices will shut down that might want to reopen again. And at the same time, if you've already watered out a well, maybe it's time to plug and abandon it. In other words, let's be a little more sophisticated on that if we don't already have the technology. Does that make sense? Do you see the what I'm getting at there, Mr. Luthi?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Office, yes, be glad to continue to work with you on what the identify should we need more statutory flexibility.
Great. And Mr. Chairman, a different topic, if I may?
Certainly, go ahead, Senator Office.
Getting back at the severance tax credit concept as a way of stimulating activity. I wonder if this is the best approach if we're going to provide some type of tax credit. And I say that because if you're looking at it from a cash flow standpoint, by the time that you are receiving the severance tax, you've already got a productive well. We're at a situation right now where we can expect that cash flow will be constrained and initial capital investment and new drilling is really where incentives need to be provided. So I'm wondering if the governor and the governor's office has had discussions with industry about where they really need the incentives, whether that's something more aligned with upfront sales tax, sales and use tax, some way that you can provide incentives for the drilling side, recognizing that really by the time you're getting the severance tax, you've probably got cash flow in place. So is there anything that we can do that provides an upfront incentive rather than just the down the road, if it produces type of incentive to give Wyoming an edge over other jurisdictions?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Office, yes, I would like to pursue that in more detail. We have had some initial conversations with industry leaders. I will say in our calls, that wasn't something that they specifically brought up, but I think it's well worth, and you've got some witnesses coming up later that I think might actually help set that framework up. So we're certainly interested in discussing that.
Okay, follow up,
You'd
Mr.
like to
Chairman.
get more details than Senator Office gave you already?
Perhaps. Mr. Chairman, one more follow-up on that. I've had discussions about concepts like amortizing the sales and use tax, not even necessarily giving a credit, but basically just alleviating the upfront cost, which then typically or often has to be paid for through financing. So you're basically paying interest on taxes that go towards the long-term financing of a project. And this isn't just for oil and gas, but this is for other large energy development projects or really any type of project in the state. So one of the conversations that I've had with a number of folks in the community is the idea of instead of front-loading sales tax and other taxes, trying to find a way to amortize it over the lifetime of a project. You don't even have to necessarily reduce the tax. You just take it off the front. You don't require that it be financed. It ends up being a net savings to the corporation, a neutral for the state, but with some structure and some better timeline. I was curious if that was something that had also been explored, or if that's something that we should be exploring as a means of providing an incentive without actually necessarily having to cut the tax rate.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Office is not unusual. You have come up with some ideas that does stretch our normal, course of business. And I can tell you everything's on the table. And I think that would be a largely legislative decision, but it would certainly be a decision that I think we would want to march forward together once we have a unified position.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Crank, can you remember what question you had? I know you were asked that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try. My question came down, we've had some discussion on waivers of penalties and fees, and I think I'm fine with waivers of fees. Can you give me an example? What are we talking about a waiver of a penalty? Because a penalty is a little different deal to me than a fee that's ongoing.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Mr.
Thank you,
Luthi.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Crank. What we normally are referring to there is if a company has missed a payment that they need to make, whether it be sales or severance, or they're late, there's often a penalty for that. And that's what we're talking about waiving. They still owe the initial tax, but it's waiving of the extra fee.
Thank you.
Representative Laux, did you have a question, or do you just have a motorized chair there? All right, no question there. No more questions. Thank you, Mr. Luthi, for the insight. And if you would give us that speech, that'd be great.
Mr. Chairman, an old politician always enjoys giving speeches to people. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Pete Obermuller. He's the president of the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. And I think I saw him on here before. Oh, there he is. Yep. Sure enough. And he won't have any trouble unmuting because he knows how to do that.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, it's good.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Greer, members of the committee, Pete Obermuller, President of the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. Thanks very much for this opportunity. Interesting discussion so far. Really appreciate this chance to talk about the oil and gas industry and what we've been experiencing over the past few months and where we might go. So just a little heads up, Mr. Chairman, about the, I'm assuming you can see my screen okay here at this point, and thanks for allowing for that. I really appreciate that. I was asked to, I volunteered and was asked to just spend a little bit of time talking about what is going on in the oil and natural gas world from a demand and supply standpoint globally, and then narrow it down to focus on what's been happening in Wyoming. And so I will do that, and then a shift into a discussion about Wyoming energy strategy and where we might go from there. What I didn't do in this slideshow, and I just want to alert you to it, I'm happy to answer questions about it or talk about it if you would like, is from our perspective, what has happened currently with the various state agencies in Wyoming and the BLM and other federal agencies with respect to relief from the crisis, the price crisis from COVID-19. So it's not in this presentation, but I'm happy to talk about it. I didn't leave it out for that. I just was more focusing on the future than on what happened in the past few months. So with that, Mr. Chairman.
Question there, Representative Greer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermuller, I do think, as you get into the and where we might go section of your presentation, is maybe help us tie in just a little bit what the federal, I guess I'll call it relief or reduction in the federal mineral royalty. What effect does that really have in terms of, again, moving forward with more drilling once price returns, or is that just temporary relief? So just some comments along those lines I think would be useful to just bring all the context of where we are together.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will do that. Just making note so I can try not to forget. Remind me if I do. Okay, with your indulgence then, Mr. Chairman, I'll just launch right in here to a little bit of if I can do it. A little bit of discussion about the demand destruction. I pulled a lot of this data from the Energy Information Administration. It is the May data. Their new data will come out here pretty shortly, but this is the most updated we have. There's a lot of interesting information in here, and I think it's a good idea to just begin this discussion with respect to oil and gas by talking about where we're at in terms of global demand. You can see on the chart on the left there, the monthly history and the forecast and the annual average of US crude oil production. So you can see that they project there, and again, this data is just slightly old, not all that, not super old, but a little bit going back to May, that they project moving forward somewhere around the annual average of where we were back in 2017 and 2018. I think that the situation on the ground has changed even since this report, and that is probably perhaps a little bit optimistic. To report out this morning that production in the United States is at its lowest levels since much earlier in the 20th century. The right there, of course, just shows where that annual change is happening, lower 48 versus Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico. The blue, of course, lower 48, and Wyoming is playing a big part in that. I will get to that in a little bit. So this one is interesting, Mr. Chairman, and I think it warrants discussion because this looks at liquid fuels product supply, so the consumption of liquid fuels, gasoline, distillate, jet fuel, those sorts of things. You can see on the left that that steep drop off. That's obvious. Everybody knows about that. What I think is interesting, and I think what we all need to be cognizant of, is that EIA continues to predict this V-shaped recovery. And the reason for that makes some sense. Once the economy opens up, the demand will come back with respect to liquid fuels. But where I think that might be a little bit optimistic, at least in particular for Wyoming, is that the demand for liquid fuels will not immediately result in restarting upstream oil and gas exploration and production. And in fact, that will probably be a slower rebound in Wyoming than in other places, given our costs and our regulatory structure. So I think that it is, for Wyoming, it looks more like a U-shaped recovery. Hopefully it's more like perhaps a Nike swoosh, but I fear that it will be a longer term U-shape. From the United States standpoint, what this looks like is that because of that, we will end up going back to being a net importer of crude oil in order to meet demand of liquid fuels as those come back online. All of this, of course, Mr. Chairman, is totally subject to changes if we have a resurgence of COVID, either this summer or in the fall.
Mr. Why do you think you're going to have a net crude oil importer when we have so much domestic oil available? Is it because it isn't the right type of oil for our refineries, or why are we saying that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. The reason why, in fact, this is EIA and others who have talked about this is really because of the lag time between what's going to happen. You can see on the right that potential forecast in 2021 of liquid fuels. That is, of course, the refined products, and we will outstrip that pretty quickly and not be able to keep up with it in terms of, at least in the short term, won't be able to keep up with it in terms of the exploration and production side. And so it'll take a while to ramp that back up. So, in the medium term, we might, depending on policies and all that, go back to being where we were prior to COVID. But for a while, it will take time for upstream to catch up with downstream demand.
Thank you.
Switching over to gas for a second, gas is interesting, and it's been, we were sort of hoping that natural gas would be a ray of light, as we knew that we were oversupplied gas. You all remember discussions during the session. Well, maybe you don't. The session feels like 100 years ago, but during the session, we were talking a lot about how gas was already distressed, and we thought that perhaps because of the reduction in production of oil, which produces a lot of associated gas, that the supply of gas would also go down, and we might have a little uptick in gas prices. That really has not played out, unfortunately. I'm not exactly sure why, but depending on how much longer reductions in production of oil happen, we may yet still see a little bit of a ray of sunshine in gas. At least I'm hopeful for that, but it hasn't played out yet. So just real briefly on oversupply, we talk a lot about what happened with Saudi Arabia and Russia, and it came at a terrible time, and it was, of course, geopolitical in nature. But I bring this up just to point out really that at this point, what we have is a demand issue, not a supply issue. The International Energy Agency is projected, as you can see there, a decline of about 30 million barrels a day. And prior to COVID, the global average of demand in oil was about 100 million barrels a day. The OPEC deal cut 10, which is only about a third of the decline of demand. The other oil producing areas, United States, North America, and others have cut as well. But at this point, it's more about correcting the demand than correcting the supply.
Pete, this chart would show that we have plenty of oil, and this is U.S. commercial crude oil inventories in 2021 to supply those refiners, it looks to me like.
Yeah, I can't disagree. Again, it's the matter of if there's no incoming pipeline. I'm assuming, Mr. Chairman, you're referring back to the comment about becoming a net importer again.
Yes. Yes.
I don't claim to be the smartest marketer and forecaster in the world, so relying on others for this. So the argument, of course, is that if the pipeline is not refilling the supply fast enough to meet the demand. Quite frankly, I hope that's the problem. If that's the problem, then operators will be trying to ramp up in Wyoming and elsewhere as best as they can. If that's the problem, and then we can get back into that average. My fear, of course, is that a resurgence will keep demand very low and the supply will stay high. If the price we pay for demand coming back is that we're a crude oil importer for a little while until our folks can get back on the ground and get back into the field, that's a price I'm willing to pay.
Well, everything the EIA is showing us here would indicate that the price of crude oil is going to be coming up. If you can't supply enough for your own use and your inventories are going down, then price of oil should be going up.
Mr. Chairman, that's right, and there has been a little bit of action in that regard. In fact, I'll move on and I can talk about that. In terms of the prices, you can see the comparison between January and May. We mentioned the Wyoming differential. So at the time, in January, WTI was more in the upper 50 range. Wyoming was doing okay, 53.45 Wyoming sweet. Now I don't actually have a realized price for May yet. Others may and can step in, but it was about $17. So in terms of WTI, to your point, Mr. Chairman, it had risen from its pretty dismal lows, and now the current price and the future month's price are hovering at around between $30 and $33. And that is projected all the way out into March, into mid 2021. So you're right that there is a little bit, you can see a little bit of a price increase moving ahead and into next year. But you got to remember where the base was. $33 per barrel in Wyoming is not going to be enough to really incentivize an enormous amount of production and drilling in Wyoming. So Mr. Ulrich mentioned this earlier, just a comparison real quick on rigs. We have 2 operating today, and a little comparison on producing and idle wells. We have a little bit of different reporting regime than other states that have more timely data. So that's why these are in March. We'll start getting the April and May data here coming soon, but we're still waiting on that. So in March, currently, as of this morning, there's still at least 316 wells that are unreported. That's not unusual to have a delay like that. That'll eventually drop to 0, as it is in January, and I think pretty close in February. But you can see just by absolute coincidence, the reported idle wells today, it was 5,370, and the total with all reported in January was 5,370. Coincidence about those same numbers, but you can still see that there are 316 unreported, and March is of course before the major crisis started. So we can expect the April report to look significantly worse than this. Gas, we talked about this already a little bit, and about where gas was in January. Early January, there were 3 rigs. Those continued to drop. I think we had 0 rigs pretty close to the end of the legislative session, maybe a little bit right after that. And we, as you can see from the realized price there, we just haven't seen an increase. Same data from March, but for gas wells in Wyoming. 316 encompasses both oil and gas wells. So both the oil numbers for idle and producing and the gas numbers will tick up depending on those 316 wells and who has not yet reported those. So maybe here, Mr. Chairman, before I move on, is I can just talk a little bit about what the agencies is doing. I want to answer Chairman Greer's question about the federal response, which has happened in sort of fits and starts, but where it is currently is that the Department of Interior has issued some more specific guidance regarding federal regulations that have been in place for a very long time. It isn't on royalty relief. What the federal government offered here is not a new program, and they really didn't do anything differently with respect to it. It existed in the Code of Federal Regulations, and in fact, Wyoming operators have used it dating all the way back, I believe, into the 80s, certainly the 90s. And so, Mr. Chairman, what they did is they accepted applications and are still accepting applications for royalty reductions for the months of May and June. They're active from May 1 through June. And the royalty reduction can go, federal royalty, of course, is 12.5%, Mr. Chairman. And that operators can ask for relief in 0.5% increments all the way down to 0.5%. I know that many Wyoming operators have filed for royalty relief. I don't know the total number or the status of approvals or denials, as the BLM is continuing to build out their database on that, as I understand it. I have interviewed a fair number of my members, and so I know that the range for royalty relief on a per lease basis is several hundred. I say per lease basis because one company can have what Wyoming BLM requested is that companies file on a per lease basis. So one company can have many applications themselves for royalty relief. As importantly, if not more importantly, is the suspension of operations.
Question here, Pete.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. So kind of getting a little bit with what Senator Rothfuss was talking about earlier. So with that royalty relief, when does that hit? So it was for the month of May and June. When does that hit an operator's, I'm just going to say their bank account, it's their cash flow. When does that have the effect on their cash flow? How many months away? Do you know the answer to that?
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I I don't know precisely, but I may in fact get a note about that here when people hear that question, and then I can't answer it, and I might be able to follow back up with that here before I'm done.
Okay. I think Chairman Anderson has stepped out, so go ahead. I'll take the chair for a few minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So real quick, the other side of the federal assistance is the suspension of operations and production. I won't go too far into the weeds on this, but there are a couple of different options here on suspension of operations, but the main thrust of it is essentially to allow an operator to suspend their operations or their production and maintain their leasehold. And Mr. Chairman, for a lot of members and a lot of the industry writ large, that really has been the most important part, is making sure that in this particularly upside down world of demand and pandemic, that decisions about shutting in wells and decisions about production can be delayed for a time longer than perhaps usual, in order to make decisions when the world has hopefully righted itself a little bit. And so there have also been several hundred applications for suspension of operations and production. There's a couple of different ways that companies can apply for that, one of which has to do with a force majeure argument, and others have to do with the conservation of resources. Just a couple different ways that can be done, and I know that a few hundred have applied there also.
Other questions? Other questions? Go ahead, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's possible that if Paul Ulrich is still on the call, that he may have an answer to your question about when it hits your books. Royalty relief, I should say. I don't know, Mr. Chairman, if he's still on or not.
He's still on, and it looks like he's ready to tell us something about it. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, good question. I would submit that for any operator that has been granted royalty relief or any of the other relief, would account for that almost immediately in their cash flow forecast as they plan, in particular, third and fourth quarter. Fully realized that won't be until after that 60-day period where you true up, what those numbers look like, and what, the difference between what was paid and what was, the percentage of relief. But it would be accounted for moving forward fairly quickly.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate everyone walking through this with me. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do next is a couple things. I'm going to just start with, because the discussion is about an energy strategy, I had the opportunity to talk with a lot of my members and got an enormous amount of feedback from them about the types of things that would be most helpful. To your question, Chairman Greer, about what did people say when we talked about when they were talking with the governor about what would be most helpful. So I'm going to start sort of broad brush on a strategy and use that as a criteria for what the committee could and agencies could do right now. I know Representative Henderson was after me to give you actual action items, and I intend to get to those. So thank you very much for this opportunity. So there were a lot of issues, and I think it's very important when we talk about these 4 criteria that I'm going to talk about, that it's the industry is not a monolith, obviously. Not only does PAW represent all facets of oil and gas, from upstream, midstream, and downstream, but also in terms of the upstream side, we have private companies, we have very small mom and pops, we have publicly traded companies. Some of these will work for some of them and some for others. Probably nothing will work for all of them equally. So please don't think that any of these are necessarily a silver bullet. However, they are, I'm going to focus on oil and gas, but in terms of these criteria, I really do believe that focusing on this criteria would be helpful for all energy sources in Wyoming, not just oil and gas. I won't put words in anybody else's mouth. They can comment on that if they want, but this is the strategy. Number one that most everyone talked to me about, and apparently the governor too in some ways, was a stable and predictable regulatory environment. So, Mr. Chairman, when all these things sort of happen one by one, we sort of lose sight of an individual company having to deal with all of them. So I want to just take a minute to remind everyone about what we did in 2019 and early part of 2020 and where we are with that. So number one, of course, you all are very familiar with and played a role in the overhaul of the permit rule. That rule is not yet stable or predictable. It's not stable in the sense that it hasn't even really begun. The very first hearings that would have been set at the OGCC to deal with the first applications under the new permit rule were delayed because of COVID. So we haven't even begun to stabilize this. And we know that we left the OGCC a lot of leeway on how to make this rule work. So we haven't started it. We don't precisely know how the commission is going to react to all of these, the kinds of decisions they're going to make. One of the things that we really asked for and that was denied was that we just pause all of this so that everyone is on the same page once we get back to a more normal setting. But now, permits have been filed, protests have been filed, and they're all sitting waiting the agency to come back. So it's very unstable and not predictable right now. Obviously, this committee worked very hard, along with lots of others, on the alteration of pooling risk and royalties. This is neither stable or predictable either. Again, this hasn't started, and we don't yet know how this is going to play out because we did some pretty unique and different things with this particular bill, particularly with respect to royalty payments for unleased mineral owners, and we left a lot of authority for unleased mineral owners to decide what to do, and we don't yet know how that's going to work out. It's going to take a lot of careful watching in the future to make sure that this works the way that we intended. I'm not convinced that the bill is 100% perfect, and so we're going to have to take a look at that yet. We know about the major new wildlife restrictions. It's stable in the sense that we have an executive order. It's not predictable in the sense that we haven't yet moved down the path of how those groups are going to work, what we're going to do with all the other possible corridors, all those sorts of things. And of course, we made a dramatic shift in ad valorem. It's quite predictable in the sense that the bill is very prescriptive of how it's going to work, which we appreciate. It's not yet stable because, as we heard last week in revenue, and we might hear tomorrow, my friends at the counties are agitating for more changes in that bill. So, Mr. Chairman, what do we do next in a 10-year energy strategy? Number one, let's let the dust settle on these things. The fact of the matter is, as it relates to our regulatory structure, particularly at the OGCC, I want to be clear about this. There are a lot of very helpful and very good rules and processes at the OGCC that that we simply need to maximize. We don't need to go in and change them. We don't necessarily need to do any more overhauls. But we do need to look at them in a way that we can make sure that we're using the we're using the leeway that we allow the OGCC in a way that maximizes our ability to do business in Wyoming. And I think that those processes are in place. Even when we talk about bonding and those sorts of things, we really don't need major overhauls. We just need to make sure that we're maximizing it. That involves some timely decision making. And I'll get to that a little bit more later in specific actions, and then a knowledgeable and a right-sized staff. Now, let me be clear when I say that. I am not implying that the current staff is not knowledgeable. They very much are. My question is whether or not they are right-sized and have the ability to move quickly for oil and gas when the time comes and when it is necessary. Finally, Mr. Chairman, we ought to take this opportunity to take a look at what, in terms of regulations, what we can keep and what we can let go. We may find, as other states are finding, that some of the stuff that we put in place may not necessarily be helpful in the long run. The second one, Mr. Chairman, again, there are four. The second one is the competitive cost environment. The fact of the matter is Wyoming is expensive. And I know if you're like me, Mr. Chairman, you're very tired of this debate. And I'm quite tired of it. And so I just want to point out, I put this quote up here. This is Johnston 2018 is from the study that you all funded in 2018 to look at taxes in Wyoming. And when I'm talking about this, I'm not only talking about taxes, and I'll get to that, but I just want to stipulate, because this argument keeps coming up, let's all stipulate that probably the first thing that most of my members said to the governor on those calls was the best thing that could happen is the price could increase. We all know that, we stipulate that. Second, we know that geology is king, because if there's no resource, there's no ability to access the resources, no matter how expensive or inexpensive it is. And the good news is that Wyoming has great resource. I've learned quite a lot about the quality of the crude coming out of the PRB, and that it's high quality and it's desirable. And so that we stipulate that geology is king. But what I ask is that also people recognize that Wyoming is expensive. And once you get past those two things, we have to reckon with the fact that Wyoming is expensive in a lot of ways. It doesn't necessarily have to do with taxes. It also has federal land component. It also has an electricity component. There's a lot more to it than just taxes. But taxes is a part, and so we need to take a look at it. Mr. Chairman, real quick on that study that you commissioned in 2018, you can see on those circles over there the effective tax rate for Wyoming compared to the rest of the states. The top circle on the right over there, obviously the highest effective royalty rate was that study's attempt to draw in both state and federal royalties. You can see that we are the highest there. And then the last circle on the bottom is the company take. They had an interesting way that they calculated that. Not my favorite, but regardless, you can see that others are, of course, higher, with the exception of North Dakota.
So
updated, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, just real quick. Chairman Anderson, you're muted.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Obermueller, I guess it's always a debate and a discussion, but I think we all know Wyoming is expensive. And I don't know if everybody will stipulate to that, as you were saying, but I think we recognize that, and a large component of that has to do with the federal lands or the federal minerals being such a key component to almost every well in the state. But I also want to start to explore just a little bit more, and maybe this goes more to price, but it still is a factor, and that is that differential that we talk about. We are, and I guess one of the things we'll look at is how do we compare with North Dakota, who's away from the huge markets like Wyoming is, but they also have better infrastructure in place. Have your members had much discussion on that issue, on the price differential in Wyoming as a result of transportation costs?
Mr. Obermueller.
Yeah, so a couple things with respect to the stipulating Wyoming is expensive. The reason why I bring that up is not to try to convince you all that Wyoming is expensive. I think what I'm talking about stipulating is that we often say geology is king and the price of oil is the most important, and so everything else doesn't matter and let's throw up our hands. That's what I'm pushing back against, is that other things do matter and we can take action. We don't just throw up our hands at that point. So with regard to the differential, yeah, lots of discussion about that, but not, I would say there's not, certainly not unanimity, but also not a lot of potential ideas, except for perhaps among some of my midstream members, about how to tackle that issue. Essentially, individual operators can deal with that differential by just by innovating and making their cost of production as low as possible, and that helps with their own marketing and their own ability to shrink that differential. But we are limited in terms of our infrastructure from Wyoming to markets and to where it needs to go, and there are projects already in the works to try to improve that. People much smarter than me who've been thinking about this for a long time have often wondered what is it about our differential that has about our infrastructure, about the system that we have in Wyoming, whatever it is that continues to keep our price lower than perhaps what it should be. And particularly now that we're looking at product out of the PRB that really is so desirable. So it's a fair question, Mr. Chairman, and I think a lot of us really need to spend some time thinking about that. I really think the Energy Authority can play a role there, which I'll get to.
Question, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Pete, yeah, I'd really appreciate more thought on that because, you know, we talk about 2% here, 3% there, and we're trying to figure out how to provide some incremental increases in profitability. When at that point, we're talking 10, 12, 15%, which nobody can explain. And it makes sense if you have an oversupply and you have to reduce the price so that you can get your oversupply into a pipeline or something along those lines. It's my understanding, though, that we have sufficient export capacity to get a high quality product to market. And if I'm understanding that right, then I truly have no explanation and no understanding of why we have to take such a haircut just to get Wyoming oil to market. So I know we don't have the answers now, and I won't press you for further answers, but we should sure learn that. And I think we need to prioritize that because the magnitude of that difference is bigger than anything else we're really talking about in terms of helping industry in Wyoming.
My understanding has always been that we're just too far from our market. You know, the natural gas, all they have to do is get it to Opal or Cheyenne, and they can wheel that gas, but we've got to get it one hell of a lot further than that, in Cushing lots of times and other places. So I think it's a transportation problem, and I don't see how we're going to solve that even with more transportation. If we put in more pipelines, we're still not going to change the distance. So I don't know that we can really affect that very much. Chris, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, again, there's just an associated cost with that. And if the cost is somehow $5, $10 a barrel, then that makes sense, Mr. Chairman. But if the cost is less than that, then we should be able to resolve it. And I can't imagine the cost of pipeline per barrel is anything comparable to it. So basically, let's just try and find out. Instead of speculating, let's try to understand this problem better. And I think the Energy Authority probably is the place to try and do that research along with the Petroleum Association and other stakeholders.
Well, it sure could do it. It's going back over plowed ground, but they can sure do that and give us a report on what the cost per mile is for transporting oil. I know Williams companies can give us that right off the top of their heads, but when you start talking hundreds of miles, you're talking a discount. So Pete, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, and I don't claim that nobody can explain it. I just recognize my own limitations that I cannot explain it necessarily. But I do know, of course, with respect to Senator Rothfuss, that there is a publicly announced project, a pretty large project, pipeline project to go from Guernsey to Cushing in the works to build. And the company wouldn't do that if there wasn't an economic reason to do so under normal circumstances. Today, it's a little difficult, obviously. So, Mr. Chairman, just beat this dead horse, but updated data. This is not from Johnston. This is from the counterpart to the Legislative Service Office in Wyoming. It's the group out of Colorado, that the nonpartisan group that provides information to their legislature. This came out in February about effective tax rates in these states, and you can see there that our effective rate is more than twice Colorado's, almost 3 times New Mexico.
I think we've had a discussion about this before, that some of the measurements on the thing might be a little swayed toward Colorado, but that's okay.
I'm not sure what you mean by that, Mr. Chairman. By swayed to Colorado, I mean this is simply the effective tax rate is simply the total value of the oil and gas production, and then the production, property, income, sales, and use divided into that to create the effective tax rate. It's the same way that Johnston did it previously for those particular taxes. So it's a way to account for the different policies and create an effective tax rate. Regardless, moving forward, in energy strategy is really to strive for competitiveness. I'm not talking about necessarily to Senator Ross's point. We're not talking about massive changes here necessarily. But when part of the reason why talking about Wyoming is expensive is because we like to, and we say over and over and over again, that Wyoming is very cheap. Wyoming is very, it's a cheap place to do business. It's number one for taxes for business. It's it's number one for investment for business. And all of that is true. And that's what we love to talk about and completely support it. It just doesn't carry over to oil and gas. And so we, in terms of moving in a 10-year strategy, we should look for, from a cost perspective and everything part of that, I'll get to a little bit more of that in a minute, but what should that competitive, we should at least strive to maintain our competitiveness with our competitor states. And rewarding investment in Wyoming, that gets a little bit more to what we're talking about in terms of infrastructure projects and all of that, that perhaps the Energy Authority and others can step in to help do the kinds of things that move us forward from a carbon capture perspective, also from a price differential perspective, and the cost to the upstream cost to produce. That investment in Wyoming is rewarded. Mr. Chairman, I won't spend a lot of time on this. Nimble and responsive BLM is, I suppose, like saying jumbo shrimp. I'm under no delusions that we're ever going to get a nimble and responsive BLM, but we can make strides with them, particularly when we have an active and engaged chief executive. And again, this is where the Energy Authority can really play a role in order to continually be engaged and forge those strong relationships with federal partners. Mr. Luthi talked about this, and I applaud the governor's office for their efforts on this. This is just, this is an ongoing effort in Wyoming. There's no doubt about it. Finally, Mr. Chairman, a state energy office. And this is where the Energy Authority comes in. This is not necessarily what they're set up to do right now. I was interested in Mr. Stege's presentation, and I think they're really heading down the right path here. And I think this committee did the right thing about moving the Energy Authority in the direction they did. And having that consistent and high level energy policy initiatives and advice to the governor, and the data that we need for price differentials, for all of that can be, we have a lot of people that do that. We have EORI, we have the School of Energy Resources, we have others that, we have the Wyoming Geological Survey, all of these that do great work. We need to consolidate them to a certain degree, not consolidate the offices, but consolidate that information for data and vision. And they, obviously support and enhance innovation, also to serve as a liaison to other state agencies. And I want to take a minute about that. So, Mr. Chairman, in Utah, Utah created under their energy strategy this Office of Energy Development. And I bring this up, and the reason why I think this is very important for the Energy Authority, and I want to continue to work on this, not just for oil and gas, but for energy in general, is that the Energy Office in Utah this is from its mission statement: the facilitation of Utah's diverse energy and minerals, advancing Utah's energy and minerals economies, provide significant and lasting value to the state. That's their mission. And they have a lot of consistency in that mission. And I want to just compare it. And again, this is not casting aspersions. I want to compare it to what we have, where we don't really have that. We have it all tied up in the governor's office, and they do a great job. Please don't mishear this. They do a very good job. But we have, when administrations change and all of that changes, then we end up not being necessarily consistent even within our own state agencies. So take, for example, Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Their mission is provide an adequate and flexible system of control, propagation, management, and protection and regulation of all wildlife in Wyoming. That's a great mission for the Game and Fish Department. Unfortunately, what happens is, and we saw it this year and we see it continually, is that agencies whose mission is not the facilitation of diverse energy and mineral sector being involved in those decision-making without any countervailing agency at the state to provide leadership and vision in that discussion. It's not saying that one supersedes the other, but they're there to counterbalance. I think that's an important goal that we should think about, is something along those lines. Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for all this time you've given me. I'm going to take a couple more slides just on immediate action. I have a couple of mentioned already. Immediate and short-term tax relief. You recall HB 243 that passed was for new wells. It's similar to what Mr. Luthi was talking about. I think he's correct. What we're talking about here is not an incentive to drill. What we're talking about here is assistance to survive and to keep the doors open and people employed for a short term until we can start to produce again and get out from under it. So the 6 months that Mr. Luthi talked about is perhaps appropriate. We can certainly talk about more there. But it can't really just end there, Mr. Chairman, because I know the challenges that you face in terms of long-term tax reform. Everything that needs to get done in Wyoming, and Revenue Committee advanced a bill last week that would increase mill levies in order to mill levies on electricity, which of course is almost entirely paid by industrial and a lot of my members in order to help fund the PSC. That is understandable. Unfortunately, when we talk about funding really anything in Wyoming, the way our tax system is, there's pretty much no way to do that without also adding to the burden of oil and gas. And so frankly, we also need to take a very hard look, and I know how difficult it is, at how to make sure that you have freedom to make decisions that don't always impact oil and gas or energy in general, because almost everything touches those.
We have a question here. Representative Greer.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I do not disagree one bit that long-term tax reform is going to be necessary. And I don't disagree at all that it's going to be painful. But this talk in terms of when I was talking with Mr. Luthi was the fact is June 1, what can we do right now? We have the possibility of having another special session. So when I look at immediate or intermediate short-term tax relief, okay, so one thing we can control as a legislature that has an impact on just the general fund, just our budget, and is dealing with severance tax. My real question is, and this is kind of whenever we've had these discussions, is at what price point and when? So, for example, if the Wyoming sweet crude, jumps to, I'm just going to pick a number, but $40, so that it is now economical. It now makes sense to start drilling again. And at that point, then we offer, and I'll just use the number that we've been saying, a 6-month holiday, or however we want to say that, on 4%. Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's a whole 6. I don't know, but of the severance tax. And will that then be the incentive for people to come back in and drill? Will that make us competitive with oil that's down in the Permian at $40 or at $45, $48 a barrel? See what I'm saying? I want to see some sort of relationship, or to have it, if we do this, structured in a way that it makes sense. So it does truly, we can sit back and say, from a general standpoint, this does incentivize drilling in Wyoming, because then the comment of, well, 6% of nothing is still nothing, but 2%, 1% of a little bit's a little bit, but we also know then we're going to get 6% of a lot more later on, and in the long run be better off. Convoluted question, Pete, but that is how we've got to have some help if we are to structure something that way.
I think the intermediate and short term is not just for drilling, but for bringing those wells back online. We're talking production, and the production we already have that's shut in would be able to come back a lot faster than drilling. So I think we need to talk about
production. Yeah, you're right.
And the drilling obviously is for a year later, but right now, if the price comes back, what can we do to get that production back?
Yeah, I agree. And that's absolutely right, Mr. Chairman, is production. Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Greer, I appreciate that. And that is always the discussion, right? Is showing some sort of, when you talk about this as an incentive, then the discussion is, can you tie it directly to drilling and production? And we can talk about that. We have talked about that ad nauseum, and it's pretty near impossible to make those connections. You're forced to prove a negative that nobody can necessarily argue with. In the case of what I'm talking about for immediate and short-term tax relief, I'm not talking about an incentive at this point. I'm hearkening back to what Mr. Luthi said about relief that is more for keeping cash, for keeping your doors open and keeping people employed right now, as opposed to incentivizing new drilling. We'll see what happens with respect to HB 243, which is for new drilling. But to Chairman Anderson's point, there are a couple things that you could do in order to reduce that cost. And I want to get to that here too with this quote that I put up here, which is, you could use 243 as a vehicle, but expand it to include restarting, reworking wells that have been idled, and in order to help them come up. You could do a new bill that doesn't have the same timelines on it, and also with a 6-month deadline or some sort of shot clock that we think is appropriate, but also a price. In HB 243, you set that price for oil at 40. I can't remember the gas price currently. I'm not at 40. I'm sorry, at 50. And I can't remember the gas price you set. Which I think is okay, but again, Mr. Chairman, going back to what I said about that my members are not a monolith. When you're looking at the cost of restarting a well, anywhere from $50,000 up to $500,000 to restart a well, smaller companies in particular will probably be more likely to be able to come back quicker than larger ones with that particular incentive, where really at the end of the day, it's going to be a price and demand increase that's going to drive that. And so, to your point, and I keep hitting on this because usually what happens in these discussions is then people go back, and I'm sure we'll hear testimony later, people will go back to this study back in 2000, which you recall, probably won't recall, but in 1999, there was in fact an incentive bill in place that the legislature repealed in 2000. And there was this study from the University of Wyoming where people say, yeah, they said that incentives don't really help. And so then we just throw up our hands. As in all things, that report is much more nuanced than incentives don't help. In fact, they say that incentives do help. They just think that what they call upstream incentives, or downstream incentives, which are tax relief, they felt like was too costly to the state. But they showed that they do in fact help incentivize drilling. What they liked a lot better was upstream incentives, which I think was the point Senator Rothfuss was getting at, is that you can actually help to incentivize exploration and production by figuring out ways to reduce the cost at the front end as opposed to the back end. And there's ways to do that. That's a longer process past the 6 months we're talking about, where again, to use Mr. Luthi's term, survive to thrive.
Senator Rothfuss, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pete, on that point, I think it would be good for us to look at and consider some of those ideas. And I'm curious, we have talked briefly about the idea of a sales and use amortization. And I was wondering if you'd had the opportunity to give some more thought to that, to explore that as a possibility, because it is intended to do just this, de-risk at the beginning by allowing you to not have to assume the cost of financing in the beginning and to look for the time when you actually have the cash flow. So that's one concept. I'd be curious about your thoughts on that. And what have others done? What is another possibility for us to look at to reduce upfront costs and provide those incentives in a way that I think there's more to be said about reducing the upfront costs to get things going again also, except for existing wells, but new wells, new operations. The upfront cost seems like where we'd want to direct it. So what other ideas should we be exploring?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In fact, I'll just use that to continue on here because there are talk about a little other cost reducing actions here in a second, so I won't move on. But well, no, I will, because this is important part of it of an upfront cost. One of them really is the high cost of electricity, and you know, there's as I said before, what a company operating the PRB needs in order to restart is going to be different than a company operating perhaps you know, in the Bighorn Basin or in Fremont County or over in the gas fields. But one thing that is pretty common across all of Wyoming's oil and gas industry is the extraordinarily high cost of electricity. This is a very thorny issue for Wyoming because we rely in terms of electricity rates and you know, protecting individual ratepayers. We rely on the industrial sector very, very heavily, way more than other states, in part because we just don't have the people to shift it to. So we understand that it's a troubling and a thorny policy issue to deal with. But in terms of exploring a strategy that would help reduce costs on the front end, dealing with the electricity issues and the high cost of electricity, both in legacy basins and in the PRB, would be helpful. And you know, there's a number of ways that we can do that, both in terms of helping to incentivize self-generation. I have a lot of members of PAW who do some pretty innovative things in terms of self-generation. But then also there's other policy avenues there that currently aren't allowed. This is not a second special session action, but something down the road where we can help to reduce. And you know, to the extent that electricity goes up, you know, via the revenue committee bill or whatever, it will just incentivize more self-generation rather than the status quo. So that's one. Senator Rothfuss.
That the energy is that energy cost high in Wyoming mostly on the private energy companies, or is it the REA also?
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to answer that in a granular level, other than what I talked to my particular members about. And I think that this issue, in fact, is on maybe your committee, but perhaps a corporations committee this interim to talk about as well. So I would have to do more work to get a more granular answer for you. I apologize.
Okay.
So that's one, Senator Rothfuss. With respect to your amortization of sales and use tax, I have had a couple of discussions about that. I'll be honest, I think that people are having a little bit tough time wrapping their brain around it. I am too. That doesn't mean that it's not workable or not a great idea. It might in fact be fabulous. I just need a little bit more time. And in fact, some of my members' tax departments have been thinking about that and trying to figure out how that might work. So I'd love to be able to continue to talk about that and work with you on that one in particular. I want to ignore that. So moving on, one of the things that outside of the PRB, but that would be helpful with respect to all these idle wells and in our legacy fields, is to make sure that our idle well bonding policy supports reclamation and investment. And I know that OGCC is going to talk about this a little bit later. And I just want to reiterate what I said earlier, that I think that the agency and industry and others worked pretty hard on an idle well, on a bonding policy just a few years back. I think they put together a pretty great structure, and that structure will works pretty well. I think that we might need to have a broader conversation about whether or not we're maximizing the flexibility within that. That helps to support investment while not reneging on any sort of reclamation obligations. I want to make sure that that's really carefully explored. Finally, Mr. Chairman, obviously it was mentioned before, but in terms of split estate, that is an ever-growing cost in the Powder River Basin in particular, where our highest quality basin is. It's a very delicate balance. You all know how difficult that discussion is, and simply supporting the delicate balance as it is would be helpful to continue to make sure that costs are at least stable, if not reduced. Finally, Mr. Chairman, with respect to the agency, we have had a little bit of a slowdown. I'll be interested to see how this goes. Again, I don't say that to be critical of the agency. They have had to weather quite a lot of work with respect to all of the permits that were coming in that we all work together to try to overcome. I think Supervisor Watson will give you numbers on how those permit numbers have gone down. And so I'm hopeful that as we stabilize that permit rule, that actually there'll be more time. But to Mr. Luthi's point about making sure that we can move quickly and nimbly, we want to make sure that that agency has the resources and the skilled staff in order to meet. So in this past budget, they asked for a new engineer. I believe that Joint Appropriations granted them that. They still have in fact, quite a bit of a reserve, and we should have continued discussion about how that works. And part of that is that we've given them so much leeway that we need to make sure that they have a skilled staff and enough staff in order to make the decisions quickly and nimbly on behalf of industry, so that we can move projects forward. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I think a couple people mentioned this, but I want to propose it as well, that this past year, I believe the OGCC had budgeted about, or past biennium, $7.5 million to plug for their orphan well program. I think that we could execute a significant surge in that. And I know that there's a question about whether or not we have the contractors and the companies willing to do it. I think it's worth a try anyway, because we're in a very different position now where with so many rigs laid down, that oil field service companies may be in a position, may be interested in bidding for these programs, particularly if we're willing to really put time and resources behind making a significant acceleration in plugging and abandoning, which not only would help keep people employed now in oil field services as an immediate help, it also helps to accelerate what is a long-term liability. And Mr. Chairman, when I say liability, I want to just make sure everyone knows that whether it's bonding or whether it's the reclamation or the orphan well program, the oil and gas industry pays for that. There's some testimony that the state is left holding the bag or whatever. The state is not. Oil and gas industry pays for it on the front end and on the back end. And we should use that reserve, particularly in this time, to really accelerate this program as essentially a jobs program right now. I know North Dakota just put an additional 30 million behind their orphan well program, and I believe we can do the same.
Okay.
Finally,
sorry, Mr. Obermueller, Senator Rothfuss, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pete, on that last comment, which I agree with, I think it's a good opportunity for us to focus on that. And this may not be a question for you, but do you think we need any statutory changes or anything from this committee to initiate that approach, or do we have everything in place right now at OGCC just to ramp that up?
So, Mr. Chairman, it's a great question. I'll let OGCC speak for themselves on their capacity. I have some opinions on that, but with respect to the mechanics, they're essentially out of their budgeted money for this fiscal year. In July 1, I believe their budget was for another 7.5 million for the biennium. Part of that, it comes from relinquished bonds, and then part of it comes from the conservation, their general fund, which is their whole fund is the conservation tax paid for by oil and gas. So what I'm suggesting, and could be a second in your special session, is that you work with appropriations and to actually plus that up. I don't know what their budget looks like now, but their budget documents, OGCC's budget documents to JAC during the session anticipated at least a $30 million reserve. And so not only, I think Chairman Greer mentioned LSRA, but there is a reserve there that could be moved towards both this and making sure that they have the staff in place necessary to do the work. They had contracted with an outside person to do the orphan well program. My understanding is that contract may not be renewed. And so we'll have to think about and talk more about their capacity.
Well, we have the oil and gas coming right up right after you, so about we can get into that. Any other questions for PAW Obermueller? No other questions? We're going to take a 10-minute break here before we start on Mark
Mr.
Watson,
Chairman?
Wyoming Oil and Gas. Somebody's talking.
Oh, it's Pete still.
Oh, okay.
So sorry, I'm not going to talk a lot about this. Because we talked about it all through the presentation, but I really do believe we have a great opportunity with the Wyoming Energy Authority. And particularly, I think we should look at their bonding, their revenue bonding. And there are some things that could be done right away in this for some cost neutral investment in infrastructure that could help with price differential and advance our goals on carbon capture, sequestration, utilization. And I talked about advocacy before, and so did Paul and Mr. Ulrich and Mr. Steege. So we are very eager to help stand that up. We want it to be successful on behalf of energy in Wyoming. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate you allowing me so much time this morning.
Yes, thank you, Pete. Thanks for all that. We're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 11 o'clock straight up. So do what you have to do. This,
This is an important notification call to you from billing.
I think it's 11 o'clock, and we're going to start back up here at the Minerals Committee meeting. And the next speaker is Mark Watson with the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. You want me to go ahead then?
I want you to go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
Okay, and you all have copies of my PowerPoint. So good morning, everyone. Co-Chairman Greer and members of the committee. Moving to page 2, a simple outline. I'm going to give an update on the new APD rule, an update on some recent drilling and production issues, just kind of the COVID thing. And then I'll finish off with the history of the conservation tax that the committee requested. So if you look on page 3, an update on the new rule. So the new rule, it's chapter 3, section 8, section 8L and section 8M. 8L was the part that states that only one operator or only the operator of a spud or completed well may submit APDs for an established DSU. And in the absence of a spud or completed well in the DSU, only APDs from the owner operator of the oldest pending or approved APD may submit or extend an APD. So what this means is that basically you have one operator in a DSU instead of competitive operators. And then section 8M, this is the part that provides instructions for the owner operator whose APD cannot be submitted or extended under 8L. And so this application provides a hearing format as a means to challenge the operators of the DSU for various reasons. And in this application, they have to show intent to develop the mineral resource. If you go to the next slide, slide 4, this is just an example. You know, I was talking about DSUs, that just stands for drilling and spacing unit. In the Pot River Basin, they're all 1,280 acre drilling and spacing units, which are basically just 2 sections. So you can see in this example, it shows 6 horizontal wells and sections 25 and 36. So that's just an example. So as a new rule, I'm moving on to page 5. Has the new rule solved the problem? So there's a couple ways we can determine that. First is on the APD submittals. And I looked at the APD count, APD standing for application for permit to drill. So for January through March of 2019, we received 9,532 permits. And then the APD count for 2020 for January through March was 1,001. So you can see that's a 90% decrease in APDs received. And that's with similar commodity prices. So this is pre-COVID. This is, you know, life was good at $50 a barrel. So you can see that we've decreased markedly the APD count. And the second way to see if this is solved is commission hearings. But as you know, Mr. Obermueller had mentioned, because of the COVID-related issues, the hearings for April and May were continued. We do have our first ADEM application set for June, and our June hearings are going to be in the Zoom format. And of course, the public can watch that on YouTube. So we'll have some of those hearings. That's next week, and we'll see how the new rule works with regard to the ADEM challenge applications. Now moving on to page 6. This is just an update on drilling and production. So I'm really just going to talk about kind of what's gone on the last couple of months. When I did this report, the rig count in May 11th, it was 4. We're down to 2 now, 1 in the Powder River Basin and 1 in the western part of the state. And then the rig count last year at this time was 30. So that's a 93% drop. And based on commodity prices, the lack of demand, that's, you know, a natural reaction by operators to stop drilling. So moving on to page 7, on the production, these are kind of COVID related issues. Operators are not required to receive approval when they shut in wells. In North Dakota, they had pretty good statistics, but they also require an operator to submit information sundry notice that they're doing that. So we ask the operators that they let us know, but we don't have to review it and approve it. And then a well can be shut in for an entire year before any additional bonding or MRT requirements are considered. So, we're kind of set up for this kind of issue anyways, where operators could do what they needed to do without us getting too involved. Page 8, continuing on with the production issue. So for the first quarter of 2019, we actually had an increase in production of 10%. So 2019 was 23.6 million barrels of oil. And in 2020, the January through March was 25.7 barrels of oil. So in our first quarter, this is obviously pre-COVID, and we're not seeing the issues yet. And first quarter gas production showed a decrease, and that's consistent with the natural decline of gas in the state just because of commodity prices. So the COVID effect, you'll see that in April production, but the April production is not due for 30 to 60 days. So we'll probably mid-June, we'll have a better idea of how many wells are shut in, what the lack of production would be, or the production drop. Moving on to page 9, this is just the historic production, so everybody can see, the last 30 years what's gone on. Last year, you can see 2019, we set a record that we hadn't set in 28 years as far as being a little over 100 million barrels of oil. Obviously, we probably won't hit that this year. Gas production, it's been on a steady decline since 2010. And that's low commodity prices and excess supply of gas. So moving on to page 10, one of the things I did is I'm on the Craig committee, so obviously we had to come up with that report and try and estimate what our production is going to be, in the near term, long term. And so what I did was I contacted the top 10 oil producers in the state, and I got responses anywhere from 20% to 90% of their wells would be shut in. So we'll start to see that effect in writing, at least in our reports, with the April production. And finally, on page 11, the committee had requested a conservation tax history. You can see 2016, 2017, and even a little bit in 18. That's when prices had dropped quite a bit. So obviously the amount we collected on the tax had been decreased. 2019, we were up to 4 million for the year. And that's pretty standard. 2010 through 2015, the average collected was $4.15 million. So that's 4 million a year is standard of what we collect on the conservation tax. And just as a reminder, it's, now we lowered it to 0 to help operators out for the 6 months, but it's normally 0.0005 mils, which is the easy way to put it. It's $5 for every $10,000 worth of product that's sold in the state. So that's kind of my quick PowerPoint presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Watson, please? Representative Greer?
I'll defer. Senator Rothfuss has his hand up first, and then I'll.
Oh, there he is. Okay, sorry. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Director Watson, I do have a couple of questions. The first is with the idle well requirements, and I think you were probably listening to the discussion a little while ago. We reworked that. We had a lot of discussion a few years ago. You were involved in that, and a lot of the idle well requirements and discussion and policy was kind of centered around the disaster that was the orphan wells with regard to the coal bed methane. We're in a little different situation, obviously, now where we'll have some idle wells very likely over the next year that may well last longer than a year of idle time, but those wells still may be valuable producers under different commodity circumstances and pricing. So it would be detrimental for those particular wells to be plug and abandoned or for any idle well fees to go online if it's a likely producer in the future. At the same time, obviously, there will be other wells that are watered out or non-producers and really qualify for kind of the spirit of that idle well concept. Do we have a way, is there any statutory changes or are there any statutory changes necessary to provide for that clear delineation, or is that something that the OGCC, you and your people can currently deal with, recognizing the difference between we want this well to come back online and this well is never going to come back online?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothis, we have that ability now, and you have to understand that when I say they have 1 year, after that 1 year is when we meet with the operators, and we meet with all the operators every year to go over their plans. And so, it's not like we're going to require bonding or, wells to be plugged immediately starting in a second year. And a lot of times companies will tell us in that plan, hey, these wells are shut in for economic reasons. We're hoping we can turn them back on. We do have some wells that, been shut in for 10 years and we realize those need to be plugged. So we work with these operators, and if they have a clear plan, we don't require that additional bonding. And so I think we have the rules in place to deal with the situation and to work with these operators on these shut-in well issues.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, a second question?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Director Watson, the other line of discussion goes back to Pete Obermueller's point about trying to use this shut down or this lull as an opportunity to do some of that plugging and abandonment of identified wells, and recognize that we've got a lot of service companies that might now have excess bandwidth, so to speak, available to get that work done, but we may not have sufficient funding or budget authorization or appropriation to do that in 2020. Can you provide some commentary on that and your thoughts of what we might be able to do, what a reasonable additional appropriation would be if necessary, and how we could proceed down that path to ensure that the folks we've got out in the field are doing their work?
Mr. Watson, before you start on that, one addition to that also is the reclamation of the pits that we have that are in the Powder River Basin too. Not just the plugging of the wells, but I think the reclamation of the pits could be a big thing for this downturn also. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothis. So we've done this before, and in 16, 17, when things slowed down, we ramped up to 800 or 900 wells instead of 300 wells, for plugging. So we've discussed this with the governor's office, and we've already put in place some new projects. One of the issues we have, especially in the Powder River Basin, is we have almost all the contractors working, and one of the choke points is the supply of cement. So in Gillette, there's only one company that's bid to supply all the cement for all these plugins. So you could have 4 projects going on with 4 different service companies, but they're all held back because there's only one supplier of cement. So, we couldn't ramp up to say 1,000 or 1,200 because there just isn't the cement out there right now. So there are different issues that you have. And also we plan these a year in advance. So, we have to do title work. We have to contact all the landowners. We have ramped up, and we do have some more projects coming in the fall. And that's both for pits and also for plugging of mostly coal bed methane wells.
Mr. Watson, that concrete thing is not new to me. Over the last 40 years, I've dealt with this time and again. And in the past, we've brought cement from Sundance, from Buffalo, from Douglas, and from Casper to do oil field work. And so I don't think we ought to let one cement plant in Gillette hold us back. But maybe they're the only ones bidding on it. I don't know. Can you expand on that?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I can. And maybe I misspoke. So it's not the supply of cement that's the issue. It's the contractor that is supplying and the cement and also bidding on these projects. So it's not the supply issue.
Well, I didn't mean to infer it was a supply of cement. I meant to infer it was a supply of the materials that weren't, the contractor couldn't get the materials to do his work out of one cement plant. So we have in the past gone to other cement plants.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's not the cement plants. and the contractors that supply the cement, they don't bid to us, but they work for all the contractors that do the bidding. And so the issue is you have 4 contractors with the rigs and the equipment plugging the wells, but they all use the same cementing contractor that supplies the cement. And that's something we can't control.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Senator Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Follow up on that. Well, I think we can't control it under the current circumstances and kind of the current way things are being done. But I think we could potentially change that if need be. And this might require some sort of legislation, some sort of temporary allowance or something else. If the key to us not going up to 1,000 wells is that we've got what are effectively self-imposed limitations on our ability to bid and contract, I do think that's something that's addressable. It's just not kind of within the current purview. So I guess what I would ask is, and you don't necessarily have to provide the answer now, but if we could get what those barriers are, say, for example, we wanted to go up to 1,000 or 1,500 wells in the near future to ensure that a broader group of service companies that may not have bid in the past, but now are idle, and we want to make sure that they have work available to them so they could do the work, but they just haven't done it in the past, can at least have a look at it. So in other words, letting out these contracts and providing the opportunity, I think that would be potentially useful. It might not, maybe nobody applies. But I do think that it's incumbent upon us to try and provide those opportunities. So I don't want us to be limiting ourselves based on those constraints. And I guess what I would ask is maybe you can come back to us or provide us a follow-up email with what those limitations are, what holds us back right now from, we'll say arbitrarily, if we were going to do 1,500 wells, ramp up from 300 to 1,500, what's in the way? And if you could let us know what's in the way, we can see if we have the ability to get that done in the not so distant future as a legislature.
Chairman Anderson, Senator Office, one comment I'd make is so we've had this kind of choke point problem in the Powder River Basin. So what we've decided, we've looked to the western part of the state, and we're putting packages together, and so companies out of Rock Springs can bid on these, and so that's what we're doing now is coming up with packages that can be plugged in addition to what we've already got contracted that'll be done this fall. So that's how we've pivoted from the problem in the Powder River Basin, is we've just gone to the other parts of the state and are putting packages together there where there are more contractors available.
Quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Rothus.
Thank you. Okay, well, Director, again, as an aspiration point, let's say we wanted to get to 1,500 wells being plugged and abandoned this year. I mean, we've got how many thousands that are still in the books?
There are 2,793.
Okay, if we wanted to get 1,500 done, I'd like to know what that would take.
Okay.
Thank you.
Senator Coe. Unmute it, Senator Coe. You're getting.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Watson, this has to do with some of the situations we have up here in the Bighorn Basin. And as Representative Greer well knows, we have heavy sour crude up here in OB east of Cody. If there's $35 WTI, they're probably realizing 12, 13, 14 bucks maybe. I've been told by producers up here that if they start shutting in wells, they shut them in, they'll never open them back up because it's heavy sour crude. Is there a price out there, realizing the price differential between the sour and the sweet, that they might change their mind? And maybe I should ask Pete Obermuller about this, but I'm really concerned, east of here in OB, which is Oregon Basin, which for a number of years was far and away the biggest producing oil field in the state. I am really concerned up here in the Bighorn Basin because it is sour crude that, once they shut them in, we'll never see them again. And do you have any comments on the price, particularly the price differential that exists, where that might be when they might consider opening them back up?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Coe, I really don't have an idea of what price they require, you know, that's something you'd have to, each operator has a different break-even point. So that's something you'd have to contact them on.
Thank you.
Follow up on that question. I saw a presentation from the OB guys that said that in the event they close down, one of the problems they have is the electricity costs up there. And they were complaining a lot about that they would have to have a lot more money in the future for their oil, and it being sour crude, that's a little bit of a problem. So that there isn't just the price of the oil, it's the price of electricity for them also. Senator Wasserberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for Mr. Watson. Very quickly, we have years ago, we had a CBM boom up here in Campbell County, and many of those companies left those wells unplugged. And I was wondering what the progress is on the CBM wells in the Powder River Basin, and what the cost for plugging them are. And I was wondering if it might be a good time right now to free up some money to finish those off.
Very timely question. Mark, you want to address that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Wasserberger. Yeah, so, you know, I go back to 2014 when I took over. You know, the big issue was the coal bed wells. There's 1,234, and there's an uproar and how much they're going to cost and how long it's going to take us. But we plugged that, you know, 1,200 wells. We plugged those in 2.5 to 3 years. You know, the costs, you know, now an average coal bed well that's, you know, 2,000 feet or less is average cost for the Oil and Gas Commission is $5,000. So that kind of gives you an idea. And, you know, I talked earlier about, you know, what's the total. So, and if you go back, even back to 14 with some of the wells we have, you know, the total amount was 5,791. So since I took over, you know, we've plugged, abandoned, converted to water wells, close to 3,000 have plugged. And then that number I said around 2,800 is what's left over. And the majority of those are coal bed. And those are the packages that we have out now. I believe we have 3 that we've started now plugging, and they're all up in the Powder River Basin. They're all coal bed wells that we're working on now.
Mark, are you converting quite a few to water wells?
Mr. Chairman, probably 5 to 10%. We convert. We allow the landowner to convert to water as long as they haven't produced any gas. We kind of have a policy that if they produced gas in the past, they could take the well, but they couldn't use that coal bed formation because we were afraid that at some point you lower the water level that it would start producing a gas again. But you know, we're more than happy, and we work with landowners all the time to convert to water wells.
Senator Wasserberger, was that everything you needed? Okay. Any other questions? Representative Greer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, Director Watson, I still want to stay on this subject. And this is getting the plugging of the abandoned wells and the Powder River Basin CBM wells done, and then the reclamation. First question I think we need to understand is my understanding, and we've got Director Parfit had him on the agenda. I don't know if he was able to testify still, but the pits that are there, those are covered by DEQ bonds. Is that those are separate and distinct from the commission? Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Grier, they do have some. If they're off-channel pits, then we have the bond and we take care of those, and DEQ has some of the other pits.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, help. You just used a term I'm not familiar with. So can you help me understand better which ones are under your purview and which ones are under DEQ's purview?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Grier, the off-channel pits are under the Oil and Gas Commission, and those are bonded individually. So we have a set bond. The Oil and Gas Commission does a set bond for each of those off-channel pits, and it was based on an engineer's assessment of what it would cost to reclaim those pits. So each one of those is individually bonded with the Oil and Gas Commission. and any pits that are not off channel are permitted through DEQ.
Oh, off channel, I'm assuming you mean they're not in a drainage channel? Is that they're completely isolated from any drainage channel?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And I'll note that Tom Kropatz, the deputy supervisor, he's going to talk right after me, and he's going to discuss a lot of the plugging program and also the idle well bond and some other things. So there's some of these things will be covered by Tom.
Okay, so Mr.
Representative Greer.
Yeah, so Director Watson, though, what, I mean, to me, and to many that I've spoken with, with this downturn, we have a lot of oil field service companies that are going to start sitting idle. If they're not sitting idle right now, or gearing down. And, you know, Senator Rothfuss asked some really good questions, but I still don't feel particularly satisfied that we're trying to solve that problem. And the simple fact is, I've said this a couple times this morning, is here we are, June 1st. We're looking at a special session, quite possibly another few days, 5 days or whatever, in a month. What do we need to do? And this has to be generated from you. Your office has to take the lead on this. The commission does, on getting these oil field service companies to work and ramping up to do more of this plugging and reclamation work. And so one, I assume, is we're going to have to do something with your budget for more appropriations reallocation. You're going to need more help to be able to oversee it. But what can we do? What effort can we put behind that to get these folks to work in the state? And
Mr. Chairman, Representative Greer, you know, we could use next year's budget. I mean, we do 7.5 million in a biennium, so that's 3.75 per year. So, I mean, it's easy to slide some of the budget into this year. You know, when you talk about the contractors, we have every contractor that's in this part of the state, we have under contract, except for one company who's working for a private company. So I don't believe there's any idle well contractors in the Powder River Basin. And like I said before, we're going to go to the western part of the state because I know there are some contractors down there. So that's why we're putting packages together down there. But, you know, if the commission or the, you know, your committee or whatever, the governor's offices, you know, we want X amount plugged, you know, we can ramp it up. But I've already ramped up adding more packages this year that I've been working on over the last month. So, you know, we've been working on that.
So, Mr. Chairman and Director Watson, I know there's only so many hours in the day to work on things. I fully appreciate that and understand that. But, you know, so you'd made a comment earlier that these are all bid a year in advance or done a year in advance. Well, the world's different from a year. So those contractors that are deemed or identified as idle well contractors, that universe has probably expanded in the last couple of months. I think that's what we're looking at. And in particular with these pits, which I have to drive through whenever we work cows, about 24 of the damn things are dangerous to livestock in particular. Those don't require cement. Those require people with heavy equipment to go in and reclaim. So that's what we're looking at. What can we do to help out? What can we do? If we keep our oil field service industry still working, when the price comes back, they'll be here for us. They'll be here to help provide all that support. And it's a bigger picture issue.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Greer, I agree that, you know, you bring up a good point on the pits because those don't require rigs and cement, you know, they're construction companies. And so that's something that we can definitely look at. And when I'm done with the meeting, I can meet with my folks and say, hey, let's get some of these, let's identify some of these pits. And when you said they're dangerous, you know, they're supposed to be fenced. And so if you find anyone that aren't fenced, you know, just let us know and we'll take care of that. But yeah, I'll meet with my folks and we need to get, you know, those are the things that we can work on because it doesn't take specialized contractors. As far as rigs and that, it's just regular construction companies. So that's something that we can work on.
Thank you.
Chairman Watson, I'm looking at that. You say you got 2,800 wells to cap still. at about 5,000 each, that's $14 million. That's not going to fit into your $7 million biennium very well. How do we go ahead and get that done? Do we just need to appropriate some more money? And then, of course, the reservoirs, I think, might actually cost more than that. And I don't know how many you have to do, but we're pretty interested in keeping those oil field contractors, not necessarily the cementers, but the contractors working also, and backfilling those reservoirs is something they do on a regular basis. So I'm thinking you're in need of a lot more money.
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me be straight on, I said there's 2,793 wells left. Now, we can't plug that in 1 year. I just couldn't do it unless I hired a lot of people. And also, when I said $5,000 a well, that's coal bed wells. We do have lots of deeper wells that, they run 400,000. We spend 500,000 on some of these wells out in the Red Desert. So, those are ones that, we've a couple of wells, it took probably a year to plug 11 wells. We were on each well for a month at a time. So, and these wells have to be plugged right. I don't want to rush. And I'm not saying I'm not in agreement with everything that's said, but, it takes time to plug some of those deeper wells. And then with regard to the pits, remember on the pits, we have a bond. So we don't have to per se budget it in. If it's, we can just, we take the bond, we pull the bond money, and we use that bond money to plug or to rehab those pits. So that's not an issue as far as budgeting, because the bond money was specific to those pits. So in that case, we do have the money.
Okay, so I guess the same question that Senator Rothfuss had is, what do we need to do to get that moving so that we're doing those pits during this slow time and keeping our oil field contractors working? And, what do you need from us to be able to get that moving?
Mr. Chairman, currently I don't need anything from the committee. I will meet with my staff, this week and start looking at some of these pits that we can get done immediately.
Is that bonding part of that a problem? Because it's bonded, all right, but the owner could do that pit himself, couldn't he, and not give you the bond?
Mr. Chairman, you're referring to the surface owner?
Well, whoever owns the pit, maybe not the surface owner. It might be the oil company still.
Well, Mr. Chairman, they're orphans, so they're owned by the Oil and Gas Commission. The companies are long gone. So, we just have to take individually, figure out what the bond money is for that pit and then get the bids out.
Oh, the pits are all orphaned also? I mean, a lot of them are orphaned?
A lot of them are orphaned, correct.
Oh, well, then they are yours. Representative Burkhart, looks like you want to say something.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just wanted to get your attention. Just maybe a really dumb question, Director. You said if a pit isn't fenced, to let you know and you'll take care of it. Does that mean you send a crew out to reclaim the pit, or you just send a crew out to fence it?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Burkhart, my comment was, when Representative Greer mentioned the safety issue with cows, we would go out and get it fenced for safety issues.
Thank you.
I guess I'm not thinking about fencing the pits. I'm thinking about reclaiming them. So I want to do more than that. I understand the safety issue, and if you have an immediate safety issue, to do that, but I want those pits reclaimed during this slow time. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Director Watson, you said a minute ago that if you wanted to ramp up the numbers significantly, you'd need to hire more people. And I don't know if that was an offhand comment or what your thoughts are there. I mean, what we're really trying to do here is basically a put people to work program during a downturn to then do something positive from a cleanup and environmental standpoint. We're going to be spending an awful lot of money in the next year or so, and this is a great time for us to tackle some of the challenges that we don't normally have the bandwidth to tackle. So I guess what I'm asking is, how many people would you have to hire? And could that be a temporary hiring for OGCC to manage this program, where if we did want to do that 1,500 that I mentioned and get a bunch of pits done, really, what would that take? To say we can't do it, I don't think that's accurate. If we needed to plug 2,800 wells this year, we could get that done. It'd be at a hell of a cost. We probably don't want to do that. But to say it can't be done, I don't think that's accurate. We can get that done. But then it comes back to, all right, well, what's rational? And how much could we get done that would be positive from a workforce standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, from a cost efficacy standpoint? And I think that's what we're all trying to get at, is what is the most we can do? If we have to hire a few more people, that's just fine.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Office, I'm not saying we can't do it. I mean, you have to understand is, there's contractors, but there's also the Oil and Gas Commission, and we're doing a lot of the upfront work as well. We're out there every day, when they're plugging and witnessing them, we're doing all the paperwork. So, it's kind of a two-pronged approach where, we have a lot of our own staff doing that work. And so when you say, okay, well, we're going to do 2,800 wells, so now I can't just hire inspectors and, I guess I could, but so there's that approach, and then there's the contractors that you're talking about. So yes, I mean, we can do that, but you mentioned it's got to be reasonable. It's got to be a reasonable amount that can be done. And also, and Tom will go into this, but we're doing a lot of work with the BLM because a lot of these pits are on federal minerals and our federal surface. So we're working with them as well. And Tom will go into a little bit more detail on that project that we're working on.
Representative Crank, you had a question.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Director Watson, how many of these orphaned pits are we talking about, or what's the number we're looking at maybe?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Crank, I don't have that number with me, but Tom can go into that because he's got more of the statistics on the pits that I don't have in front of me, but he'll talk next.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Any other questions for Supervisor Watson? Any other questions? Any other questions? Hearing none. Thank you, Mark, for your input. We appreciate it. And you're getting that we're interested in moving this stuff forward so we can do this during the downturn and keep our contractors busy, whether it be cement contractors or dirt contractors. So more to follow.
Okay.
Thank you. Next is Tom Kropatch. You've heard several times Supervisor Watson referred to him as having all the answers we ever wanted on this subject. So, Tom, can you fill us in here, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize up front for the lateness of us providing our documents on this section. I'm going to start with the bonding, shut-ins, and plugging requirements. We originally weren't planning on presenting on those topics in detail. And so I think everybody should have a copy of that. We provided it last week. If not, I know it's on the committee's web page for anyone to download. I wasn't going to share my screen, but if someone would rather I just share the screen to look at the details, I can do that. But we'll just start. I'll jump in on slide 2 and
if you can share the screen, that'd be good.
You'd rather share the screen? Okay.
Well, I don't have to, but if you could, that'd be good. And you're a wizard, so you can do that.
I don't know if I am or not, Mr. Chairman. I hope everyone right now is seeing the PDF of my presentation.
Yep.
Okay. I'll just jump in on slide 2, Mr. Chairman, and summarize kind of the commission bonding. The commission's provided authority for bonding in the statutes 30-5-104, which essentially says that the commission has authority to require the furnishing of a surety bond or other guarantee condition for or securing the performance of the duty to plug each dry or abandoned well or repair the wells causing waste and compliance with the rules and orders of the commission. So from that statute, the commission developed rules on bonding. They're found in Chapter 3, Section 4. And I'll provide a summary over the next couple of slides of what those rules are. But essentially, when we're talking about bonding in this scenario, I'm speaking about well bonding, so typically idle well bonding, but really an operator has two options for bonding. You can supply an individual well bond that's currently set at $10 per foot of well bore, and that would be for every well that that operator owns, whether it's producing or idle, whatever the status is. They can post an individual well bond at that rate for every well. That makes sense in most cases for operators who only own a few wells, because once you get more than a few wells, then the bond amount there becomes large. So what we also allow for operators to do is supply a blanket bond. That blanket bond is currently set at $100,000. And then if you do a blanket bond and you have idle wells, then you need an additional idle well bond amount when that amount starts to exceed the $100,000 blanket bond that you have posted with us. So I'll kind of go into detail on the next slide on what the idle well bonding requirements are and what that program is. But in our rules, a well is determined to be idle when it's not producing, injecting, or disposing. So immediately when an operator shuts in a well or when it's no longer active, by our rules, that well is considered idle. And idle wells may require an increased bond up to $10 per foot, with accounting for the existing bond an operator may already have in place. At the commission, we also allow an operator at least 1 year of having the well shut in before we start to request idle well bonding. And that's there for a couple of reasons, that leeway on when to start looking at idle well bonding. Mostly we understand that wells get shut in routinely for various reasons. Equipment may go down that may need repaired. There may be short-term pricing or even longer-term pricing, but short-term pricing requirements that an operator needs to have shut in, or other third-party effects that an operator has that may require their wells to be shut in. So we allow time for an operator to get wells back on production before we start asking for additional bonding. And essentially we've determined 1 year is kind of a good time to allow an operator to get work done. There's weather conditions, there's other things that may be in effect, wildlife restrictions, other things that may require an operator to take some time to get wells back on. So once the wells hit a year, then we start asking that operator for idle well plans. We do work with every operator in the state on their idle well plans, as long as, and again, maybe I should have prefaced this, but we're looking at mainly fee wells here. The BLM does their own on federal wells, and actually the Office of State Lands and Investment also does bonding on state wells. So when we talk about this, we're mainly talking about fee wells from the commission standpoint. But, an operator, as I mentioned, has to post a bond of $10 per foot for idle well bonding. But an operator can also request, in our rules, there's a process for them to request a reduced bond rate. So if they have specific situation where their wells could be plugged for cheaper than that, and they can show us information, bids, for example, from contractors to plug wells cheaper than the $10 per foot rate, then they can provide that information to us, and we can review and reduce the bond rate. And we have done that for many operators in the state who have provided that information to us. The idle well bond amount, again, is reviewed annually or upon request of an operator. So if an operator has a set of wells shut in and they're able to get those back on production, or they get a bunch plugged or remove it from the idle well list and they want their bond reduced earlier than the next annual review, then we'll review it at any time the operator requests us to do that. Again, we can accept a plan of operation in lieu of bonding. So that's the kind of the annual review that we do with operators. And so they can give us plans for the idle wells to either P&A the well or otherwise take an action to get it off the idle well list, whether that's return it to production, convert it to an injection or a disposal well potentially, and have that active, transfer the wells to other operators if they're in the works of transferring wells that are idle. There's various ways they could remove that from the list. The plan does require they commit to plug or return to active status 10% of their idle wells each calendar year. And that's something that was new in the revised rules that we did. I think that went effective in 2015. But what we're trying to do is get a kind of a baseline set of plans from an operator on their idle well list to to get wells either returned to production or plugged instead of just letting them sit idle for years or sometimes decades. The plan shall not exceed 1 year from date of filing. And essentially what that means is we just review annually with the operator. And then the plan is approved by the supervisor at the end of that process. So most operators submit plans to us for review and reduce bonding amounts based on some wells being idle, some wells having plans to get plugged or return to production or otherwise off the list.
Hey, Tom, before you go further on that previous slide, you had a $100,000 bond, blanket bond. I know we've talked about this before, but it escapes me. Is that blanket bond for a well or for a series of wells, or how does that blanket bond work?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. The blanket bond can cover any number of wells. There's no set limit. An operator has the option to either post an individual well bonds for every well they own, or they can post the $100,000 blanket bond. And then what we do when we do the annual idle well reviews is consider that amount as part of their idle well bonding. So if they have less than 10,000 feet of well bore, then when we look at the $10 per foot bonding, that would cover all that. As soon as they exceed that amount and those wells are idle, then we would add to the operator blanket bond the additional idle well bond amount. And I'll get into the amounts a little bit more in the next few slides on what we actually hold in bonding and some specific amounts and things like that.
So Tom, if an operator has 50,000 foot of well bore, the $100,000 blanket bond still covers that?
Mr. Chairman, it would cover that as long as they're active. If they were all to be idle, then they would need $500,000 amount of bond. And so they would need to post an additional $400,000 bond. Again, assuming they don't have any plans to try to plug those or return them to production or something else that we may accept in lieu of bonding.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, I'm sorry. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tom, getting to a question, you've got some nuances here that I was asking about a few minutes ago. And do you take the economics of the well, kind of the future projection of the economic viability of a well into consideration in any way with regard to the idle well bonding requirements?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, we can. We require an operator, and an operator can supply any of those details to us that they want. I will kind of get into the question that some of the questions you had earlier on requiring plugging of wells. But I'll just kind of mention that now. From the commission standpoint, we would not require an operator generally to plug a well. If they think it's economic for whatever reason in the future, many times, even wells that don't look economic from an oil or gas production standpoint may be economic for an operator to convert to injection, for example, down the road, or to convert to a disposal well down the road. So we generally would not require an operator to plug a well. We would require that they, meet our rules and regulations on bonding, for example, on reporting of the status and current reporting on the wells. But unless the well, has a problem, let's say it failed a mechanical integrity test and it can't be repaired, we wouldn't generally require just a idle well to be plugged at any certain time frame. I know there's other agencies, maybe the BLM, for example, does more reviews regarding that and requiring wells to be plugged. But from the commission standpoint, we don't require that. We'll allow an operator to keep an idle well for, in fact, there's some out there that are 10 years old or older than that, several decades old, because they, especially when you look at some of the older fields where they do water floods or other type of enhanced recovery, they may, those well bores may have some future use. For example, if an injection well that they currently have goes down and has an integrity issue, for example, they could convert a different well. So we allow them to do that, but they also have to do bonding or other things associated with keeping it idle.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Thank you. So Tom, getting back to the kind of the idea that I was exploring before, though, if you've got a time like we're in now, where, 1 year ago you had a good strong price of oil. Now you've got a low price of oil, although it's recovering. So this probably would have been a better example when it was down sub $10 a barrel. But if you've got productive wells, but you literally just don't want to be producing those wells right now because of the economics of them. I mean, let's say we've got a good, strong producer. That seems to be a very different concern or consideration relative to we've got a low producer and we might want to stimulate it later, or we might want to convert it to a water well later, to the point where you've got economic potential for the well that almost offsets really the need for a bond. I mean, if you can guarantee that there's more than $5,000 worth of production value in that well moving forward, and that's not that challenging. It seems like that's a very different circumstance than a watered out well that you might stimulate later. But it sounds like when we look at the terms of this may accept plan of operation in lieu of bonding, if I've got 100 idle wells, I'm going to have to put 10 of them on at the end of a calendar year, and there's no exceptions to that unless I want to bond for those. Is that right? So if my strategy is to try and secure the resource and optimize the financial viability of the resource, that's not a good enough reason not to turn 10% of them back on.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I think you have a good point there that, wells that are highly productive that are only shut in due to the current price that, no one necessarily has a good understanding of how long they last, and us requiring bond on that. Again, an operator can submit any of that information to us that they have and have available for, their specific scenario, and we can consider that. The supervisor does have, quite a bit of leeway in this rule to accept plans from operators and in lieu of bonding. And so I guess I would just say if an operator has that information and comes to us with that information, then we would consider that in the plan and either not require additional bond or, take a holistic view of all of the wells that they have and see, are there other wells that they could do some plugging on, that are idle in lieu of bonding. Again, we work with every operator because everyone, even in whether the prices are low like they are now, or even when prices are good, operators have a specific scenario based on their wells. And so to understand why they have idle wells, what they're going to do with them, what their plans are for them, is specific to each operator. And so we're more than willing to listen to any operator and reduce bond or not require additional bond in a scenario such as what you provided.
But Mr. Chairman, and one more follow-up. All of this language that you've got in this slide, though, has a lot of shalls. And it doesn't sound like may or subject to the director's discretion. It sounds all like shalls. So are these kind of soft shalls that'll turn into a may, depending on circumstances, or how is this working? It seems like there's no exception language here.
Sure, Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss. That some of that may be because of just the way I summarized the rule and pulled out a few of the bullet items from what's in the rule. So, I think the supervisor, and again, if an operator didn't agree with the supervisor's discretion, they can always ask the commission for some relief too, if it wasn't, if a supervisor decision wasn't to their liking. So I think there's a lot of leeway within the rule itself that allows us to consider those scenarios. And I apologize if maybe I didn't quite capture that here in the summary of what I pulled out for my bullet presentation.
Oh, no worries. Thank you.
Representative Henderson, you have a question.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this was answered earlier when I was wondering, the testimony was that if we were to do some of these things, it would require lots of additional manpower. But I guess the more I listen, the more I'm asking, are we agile enough, given that we know what's going on with the market, and we know what we have, you know, across the state in terms of the wells. Are we agile enough to develop a market posture to respond to different circumstances as we go through, you know, these changes? But what I'm saying is really trying to build on what I believe Senator Rothfuss is talking about, is that, you know, we have an opportunity here to keep some people who are now currently idle, maybe keep them active enough to meet their minimum cash flow requirements to benefit the different areas of the state. If those resources were capable of being brought together in a circumstantial, of course, but you know, a timely response to market conditions.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Henderson. Not to speak out of turn with Supervisor Watson, and you know, obviously we'll have to get together and kind of plan for the programs going forward with the agency on orphan wells and things. But for example, now we've had several of our inspection staff working on the orphan program over the last several years. But I think there's a few people that we can pivot over to help assist with that program, getting some of the additional projects out that Supervisor Watson spoke about in the southwest part of the state. You know, inspectors that over the last couple of years were watching rigs and watching the wells getting drilled and things like that, that obviously are slowed down now during this time, that we could probably use in this program to help facilitate doing some of the legwork that needs to be done to get a project moving forward, contacting the landowners, making sure all the title work and the liens and everything have been done, making sure all the processes we have to go through on equipment abandonment and all the legal processes to declare that abandoned so we can remove it from the well. Just different things. I think we can pivot some of our inspection staff over to help with that. So I think there is an opportunity to help facilitate moving some projects forward. Supervisor Watson mentioned some of the partnerships we have with the BLM, for example. Representative Grier mentioned some of the pits that are out in the Powder River Basin. Many of those are also on federal wells or federal permitted pits that we didn't mention, but you know, DEQ does approve or does have permitting on the on-channel reservoirs. The Oil and Gas Commission also does the off-channel, but BLM also does off-channel that are on federal surface or associated with federal wells. And so we actually have partnered with the BLM. They've given this agency some grant money to help facilitate them plugging orphan wells and or closing reservoirs. So there's a project that we're currently doing with the BLM on some orphan federal reservoirs. We'll be doing more of that this summer as we move forward with the BLM, because with the processes they have to go through to get orphan wells plugged, they needed some assistance in getting timely bids put out so that the funds they had available to do that could be used, you know, within their budget cycle versus having it revert back to the federal process. And so we are trying to help facilitate getting additional wells plugged, whether they're the fee wells and state wells that we would plug or the federal wells that the BLM would deal with. So I can speak more to that and answer questions as we go through the end of the presentation on our orphan plugging. But I think there is an opportunity to get some additional work done, whether it's the projects that Supervisor Watson mentioned, or even some of the reservoirs and other things within the Powder River Basin and around the state that would put to work some of the additional contractors out there and not just the plugging service companies.
Tom, Representative Crank has a question.
Yes, thank Tom. We've been talking, kind of trying to put these people to work. I'm assuming all the good operators probably are completing reclamation all the time on their wells and pits. Is there any incentive to help those folks, the operators? They probably know who can do this and get it done, but to help them keep their facilities from becoming orphaned wells and get those things cleaned.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Crank, I think there is, I mean, there's a couple options out there. I think one of the bigger incentives right now is as those service companies lose work from, you know, the industry operators, either on drilling wells or operating wells, we see costs go down. So if an operator has wells that need to be plugged or reclamation work that needs to be done on their own locations, it's cheaper now than it is, than it was last year, most likely, because just like any other company out there, as they're losing work, they're trying to keep their people busy. They're reducing their costs. They can maybe get their supplies cheaper than what they could last year when there was more demand for their services. So I think that's obviously one incentive for us and for the private industry to get work done right now, as it's cheaper. Really another incentive and partly why the idle well bonding program is in place is we think that's an incentive to get operators to plug wells or to do reclamation that needs to be done. Why would an operator want to hold on to a well that has no further or future need or benefit to that company when it should be plugged? If there's a well out there that should be plugged and they're not wanting to do that, then they would need to post the bond. But in some ways, that's an incentive to just get the well plugged instead of just putting money up, to hold this idle well that has no future benefit for that company. So, really the idle well bonding program, we'd be happy to have no idle well bond if operators could, if all the wells had near-term or future incentive or future benefit to that company, and the wells that didn't got plugged, then that'd be great. So, I think really in reality, from the commission standpoint, I'm not sure what else we could do to help incentivize that work, but I think really the cost reduction is probably the biggest incentive for those companies. But every company has their own, capital expenditure plans that they've got to look at in these times.
Tom, one other question. We were talking to Supervisor Watson about the 2,800 wells at $5,000, and he said there was quite a few that were more expensive than that. My question is, how many are those CBM wells that we could actually do for $5,000 or less and get done, so that maybe we have, instead of having 2,800, we have 300 wells left that haven't been done?
Mr. Chairman, I've got some numbers off on a different monitor, and I don't have a good summary of all of them separately, but I'm going to guess that probably out of the 27 or 2,800 or whatever the total number was, that we probably have 2,900, probably 2,500 of those are coal bed methane wells, maybe even slightly more. There's one operator that we had to orphan a couple of years ago that had approximately 300 somewhat shallow oil wells in the northeast part of the state. And so that's the majority of the non-coal bed wells that are out there that are orphaned. But there are a handful, maybe close to around 50, I would say, of deeper wells, maybe not quite that many, scattered throughout the state that we are trying to prioritize. Many of them, the ones that Supervisor Watson mentioned earlier, that we'd add into the additional packages. But the costs on the deeper wells can vary depending on how you break it down. We usually look at because the idle well bonding is set in this rate, but as a per foot plugging cost for well bore. And so we've seen anything in the range of, for some of the coal bed wells, especially during the last downturn, cost to plug maybe around $3 a foot. And, other times, like last year, where service companies were busier with industry, costs increasing up to $7, $8, $9 a foot, even for coal bed wells. The deeper wells, obviously, in many cases would be a cheaper per foot rate than a total overall cost to plug, just because you have a larger depth that balances those costs across for the per foot rate. But, the deeper wells can significantly increase. Older wells can increase cost, but the deeper wells that may have more wellbore issues that we have to deal with as we plug them can increase the cost. So there is a wide range of costs on plugging those wells.
Yeah, but if we put a program together to do CBM wells, we could knock out 2,500 of the 2,800 we right now have in our inventory. Is that the right numbers?
Mr. Chairman, that's as an approximate, give or take.
Yeah,
that's pretty close. Again, as Supervisor Watson mentioned, we do have and we've had it for a couple of years, and I've tried to work with A&I and state bidding and different requirements and bids to try to work around the kind of the choke point of the cement service company that many of the contractors use. There are a couple companies that do their own cementing throughout the process, so they don't rely on that other the one contract, the third party contractor. But that, especially in the Powder River Basin on cold lead wells, that can really limit the total number we have, because even if we put a bid out and somebody wins it, if they're both using that same contractor to do the cementing work on the location, then that crew is not working on the other project at the same time. And so we've had that scenario come up where they were the contractor for two different plugging crews, and so as one sat, the other wells weren't getting plugged, as they were working on one project. So it can limit that.
If we approach that with a large quantity, all of a sudden the cementing contractors are going to change. It's going to change the game. They're not going to be down there doing 2 or 3 different contractors. So anyway,
Sure, Mr. Chairman, and we may also attract contractors from farther away than what we have on the normal projects.
Yeah.
In the past, because there's not as much work out there going around.
Yep. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I'll move on to the next page here on the presentation. Still back to bonding. The types of guarantees that we accept, we'll accept surety bonds, letters of credit, certificate of deposit, the CD or a cashier's check. Right now, actually, the numbers as of about last week were we hold approximately $159 million in idle well bonding. Out of that $159 million, $16 million is in certificates of deposit, the CDs. 6.6 million was in cash submitted to the commission, and then 13.8 million in letters of credit. So the remainder, and the majority, 122 million or so, is in surety bonds. And just broken down by operators and bonding amounts, we have idle well bonds that range from $6,000 for an operator up to 30 million is the largest single idle well bond that we hold for an operator. And I will state on that operator, the largest bonded operator, they'd rather not supply a plan to us. They said it's easier and cheaper for them to just post a bond. So they just post a bond on idle wells. They don't give us plans. They actually do give us some plans as far as what they're going to plug and that kind of thing, but they'd rather just not spend the time to work through that with us every year. They just want to post the total bond amount. So that's what they do, and that's where we get the 30 million from for that operator. The last thing, and we kind of discussed this with questions from Senator Rothfuss, but we do have a requirement that when in Chapter 3, Section 16, that when wells change status, an operator just notify us of the change in status. So if it's a producing well and the operator shuts it in, or they temporarily abandon that well, then they're supposed to submit a sundry notice to us that reports that change in status. And in addition, on the monthly reporting, all wells that are not plugged essentially need to be reported. So if a well's shut in and operate and has no production, they list the well on the report, and the status is shown as shut in, and then that's the reporting that happens. If the well's producing, these are the monthly production reports essentially. If the well's producing, then they list that status and give us the volumes that were produced. And then if a well changes status, again, if it's shut in and it goes back to production, they're supposed to give us sundry just to notify us of that change. They don't need our approval to do it. We want to have updated records. The rules require that if a well is shut in, the operator requests an extension every 2 years. Normally, or historically, that was done via the sundry notice. But since we do annual idle well reviews, we just use that as their approval to continue keeping the well shut in. It's listed on the idle well review. They either provide a plan or they tell us it's going to remain shut in. Once we review that annual plan and approve it, then we consider that the approval to continue keeping the well shut in. So the other requirement for shut in or TA'd wells is that every 5 years they need a mechanical integrity test to make sure that they wouldn't impact either other hydrocarbon producing zones or water zones that need to be protected. So again, as mentioned in some of the questions with Senator Rothfuss, the commission doesn't typically require plugging wells unless they fail an MIT and can't be repaired. And there's some other scenarios we could come up with out there where we would force an operator to plug a well if it was creating waste of some sort or not protective of correlative rights or things like that. But generally, that's not our requirement to plug wells. And then again, if the well shut in or TA'd, they do the monthly reporting and the bonding, and the well can remain idle. The bonding could go away when the well's either plugged or producing. The monthly reporting is there until the well's completely plugged and abandoned. And that's what I was going to present. And then any other questions or more discussion on the orphan program or the idle well program, I'd be happy to discuss.
Any questions? Any questions for Mr. Kropatch? Any questions for Kropatch? Any questions? I know I can always get one out of Rothfuss or Greer. No, you really covered it, Kropatch. You really covered that well. All right, no questions for him. Thank you, Mr. Kropatch. We look forward to working with you on moving these wells up faster and the reservoirs also.
Mr. Chairman, we'll be happy to provide updates on that at any of the next meetings, or if anybody has questions, feel free to call me and we'll be happy to discuss.
All right, good. We're right on schedule. It's noon. We're going to take a break till 1 o'clock for lunch. So enjoy your lunch and be back at 1 o'clock, and we'll hear from Todd Parfit on the DEQ. Thank you.
Mr.
Yeah.
Co-Chair, before we
Yes.
break, just
Yeah.
a couple things is one is I've got a 12:30 marketing meeting, so I may be a little late coming back to this meeting, which is fine. One question for LSO is, who do we have signed up for public comment? So we could get that list. The list that I got was everyone that was scheduled on the agenda. And I know we had a couple other people who had signed up to make comment. The other thing, Mr. Chairman, is speaking with Josh Durrell with the Business Council, is they would like to have a hard stop at 4 o'clock because they are rolling out the first webinar on 10:04. And so it might be the case that if we have legislative ideas or bill drafts, that maybe we save that discussion till after the Business Council at 4 o'clock, if that works with everyone and with you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, that'd be good. Would like to have them get that done. Works for Burkhardt, so that'll do.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. I'll join as soon as I get done, but this just a requirement of my job I need to do. Yeah.
Okay, all right. We'll see you at 1 o'clock.